There is a manuscript in a cedar box in the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion in Aksum, in northern Ethiopia, that contains a chapter Christian scripture does not. The chapter is numbered 22 in the book that the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition has preserved without interruption for roughly 17 centuries, and it describes something that the councils of the Latin and Greek churches decided the ordinary reader was not to see. The passage is short. Its author records that he was taken to a mountain in the far west of the world and shown 4 hollow places carved into the rock, and that inside those places he saw the dead, not one class of the dead. 4. Separated by wall and by function, sorted by a principle he was told to write down. The angel walking beside him is named in the text. The angel explains the sorting, and then the passage says a thing that no version of the Bible in wide circulation today contains. It says that the dead do work, that they are not asleep and they are not idle, that the souls of the righteous, held in the second of the 4 chambers, participate in the ongoing maintenance of something the text calls the order of the heights, and that when their work in that chamber is complete, a portion of them is sent back down into a body that is being formed on the earth, so that the work above can continue and the work below can be accomplished at the same time. The name of the book is Enoch. The chapter is 22. The author, writing in the first person, is presented as a man who lived 7 generations after Adam, who walked with the messengers of the sky, who was taken up and shown the interior of creation, and told to record what he saw for a reader who would come after. That reader was not his contemporaries. His contemporaries, according to the tradition preserved at Aksum, already knew. The reader was someone alive far in the future, someone who would find the account after the councils had done their work and the material had been removed from the Bible everywhere except the highlands of Ethiopia, someone who would need to understand a doctrine the church had erased from Christian teaching by the end of the 4th century of the Common Era. That doctrine has 2 parts. The first part is that the dead are not passive. The Book of Enoch says the dead are load-bearing, that they carry a portion of the structure of creation on their spirits, the way a column carries the weight of a roof, and that if the chambers of the dead were emptied at once, the structure above would not stand. The second part is that the traffic between the world of the living and the world of the dead is not one-directional. Souls go up, souls also come down. Not all souls, and not at the same time, but according to a system Enoch records with the same clinical detail he uses when he records the paths of the sun and the courses of the moon in the astronomical section of the same book. The system has stages. The stages are numbered. The souls that pass through the stages return to bodies that are being prepared on the earth, and the reason they return is not what a modern reader would expect. The return is not for punishment. It is not for reward either. The return happens for the completion of work that could not be finished the first time around. The Council of Laodicea met in the year 364 of the Common Era, in a small city in what is now western Turkey, and the assembled bishops issued a series of decisions about which books could be read aloud in the churches under their jurisdiction. The 59th canon of that council forbade the reading of any book not on an approved list. The 60th canon supplied the list. The Book of Enoch was not on it. Neither was the doctrine that the book had taught for 400 years by that point, which held that the dead were active and that souls were returned to earthly bodies as part of a system the sky itself was said to operate. That doctrine did not survive the 5th century of the Common Era in any Christian church west of the Ethiopian highlands. The book that had transmitted it was removed from public reading, then from private ownership, then from the memory of what Scripture had once contained, so completely that when the Scottish traveler James Bruce brought 3 GE's copies of Enoch back to Europe in the year 1773, the scholars who examined them treated the book as a newly discovered artifact from a lost tradition rather than as a text their own churches had once read aloud on the Sabbath. The 7 teachings this account will reconstruct are drawn from the book those bishops removed. They are drawn from chapters 22, 39, 41, 61, 69, 103, and 108 of the Ethiopian text, as translated from the Ge'ez by Dr. Ephraim Isaac in 1983, and they are corroborated, where corroboration is possible, by the Aramaic fragments that Joseph Millick reconstructed from Cave 4 at Qumran and published in 1976 under the imprint of the Clarendon Press at Oxford. The teachings share a common shape. Each one identifies a piece of the Enochic doctrine of the dead that the Latin canon lost. The teachings trace each piece to the surviving manuscript that preserves it. They also show what the removal of that piece did to the picture of the afterlife that most people who grew up inside a Christian tradition inherited. And each teaching demonstrates that the teaching Enoch actually recorded was not the teaching that the council substituted for it. and that the difference between the two versions is not a matter of interpretation but a matter of what the text on the page actually says in the language it was written in. The third teaching in the sequence, the one this account will spend the most time on, is the one that the 4th century councils had the most concrete reason to remove. That teaching describes the mechanism by which the dead power the maintenance of creation, and it names the specific reason souls are sent back down into bodies. The passage is preserved in chapter 41 of the Ethiopian text and confirmed in fragmentary form in the Cave 4 material. Enoch's word for the place involved is a Giez compound. The standard English translations render as the storehouse of spirits, and the same passage describes that storehouse as a system with intake, with retention, with release, and with return. Council members in the middle of the 4th century would have read the passage in Greek from a copy circulating in the Eastern churches, and no Christian bishop after the year 405 could have quoted it in a sermon without being censured, because by that point the doctrine it taught had been designated heretical by the two men whose writings would define the Latin canon for the next 1,000 years. The Book of Enoch that survives in the Ethiopian canon is not a single continuous composition but a compilation of 5 distinct works stitched together by the copyists of the tradition that preserved them. The 5 sections were written at different times, by different hands, in different centuries, and each one addresses a different set of concerns. Together they form the longest surviving pseudepigraphon of Second Temple Judaism, and they contain more material about the interior architecture of the sky, the sorting of the dead, the ranks of the messengers, and the mechanics of what happens to a soul after the body stops than any book that made it into either the Jewish or the Christian canon. The first section, chapters 1 through 36, is called the Book of the Watchers. It is the oldest part of the compilation, generally dated by the scholars who work on the Aramaic fragments to the 3rd century before the Common Era, and it is the section that contains the famous account of the 200 fallen angels who descended to Mount Hermon and took human wives. Chapter 22 of the Book of the Watchers describes the 4 hollow places carved into a mountain in the far west of the world, where the dead are held in sorted compartments waiting for the day of judgment, and it is one of the 2 chapters this account will spend the most time on. The second section, chapters 37 through 71, is called the Book of Parables, and it is the section on which the doctrine of the soul's return to earthly bodies most directly rests. The Book of Parables is generally dated by mainstream scholars, following the arguments of George Nicholsburg in the Hermeneia commentary published in 2001 and confirmed by James Vanderkam in his subsequent work, to the last decades before the Common Era or the earliest decades after it. The section contains chapter 39, which describes what Enoch saw when he was taken to the dwelling of the righteous dead and shown the elect who had already departed. It contains chapter 41, which describes the storehouse of the spirits and the mechanism by which the storehouse operates. It contains chapter 61, which describes the return of the breath of the righteous to bodies being prepared on the earth in the language the standard Giez text uses for the intake and release of the dead. Chapters 39, 41, and 61 together contain the material that makes up teachings 2, 3, and 4 of the 7 this account will reconstruct. The third section, chapters 72 through 82, is called the Astronomical Book. It records what the messenger, Uriel, showed Enoch about the paths of the sun and the moon, the gates through which the sun rises and sets, the courses of the winds, and the 364-day calendar that Enoch was told to teach his descendants. The astronomical book is not the primary source for the teachings on the dead, but it establishes something important about the way Enoch understood the sky. He understood it as a mechanism, not a metaphor for a mechanism, and not a symbolic representation of one, but a working structure with moving parts, gates, storehouses, keepers, and cycles that had to be maintained by named entities carrying out numbered responsibilities. That framework of thought will matter when the storehouse of spirits appears in chapter 41, because Enoch describes the storehouse of spirits in the same language he uses for the storehouses of the winds and the gates of the sun. The dead, in his account, are handled by the same kind of infrastructure that handles the weather. The fourth section, chapters 83 through 90, contains the dream visions, in which Enoch describes 2 symbolic visions of Israelite history rendered in the code of animals representing peoples. It is the shortest of the 5 sections and the least relevant to the teachings on the dead, though it does contain a passage in chapter 90 concerning the resurrection of the righteous that will provide corroborating material when this account arrives at the 5th teaching. The 5th and final section, chapters 91 through 108, is called the Epistle of Enoch. It contains the closing chapters of the composition, and among those closing chapters are two passages of particular importance for the doctrine of the soul's return. Chapter 103 describes what happens to the spirits of the righteous who died in sorrow and what they will be granted at the time of their return. Chapter 108, the final chapter of the entire compilation, describes the sorting of the humble spirits and their assignment to the roles they will fulfill on the earth when they are sent back down. Both of these chapters are recorded in the Ge'ez manuscript at Aksum. Chapter 108 is preserved in fragmentary form in the Cave 4 material at Qumran. Chapter 103 appears in a fragment recovered from Cave 4 and catalogued as 4Q204. The complete book existed in Aramaic in the late Second Temple period. Fragments in Aramaic were recovered from Cave 4 at Qumran beginning in the winter of 1952, catalogued by Joseph Milik across the subsequent 2 decades, and published by him at the Clarendon Press at Oxford in 1976 under the title The Books of Enoch. The Aramaic fragments cover the Book of the Watchers, the Astronomical Book, the Dream Visions, and portions of the Epistle. They do not cover the Book of Parables. Milik used this absence to argue that the Book of Parables was a Christian composition post-dating the Qumran community, but that argument has since been rejected by nearly every major Enoch scholar working in the field, including Nickelsburg, Vanderkam, John Collins, Michael Stone, and Matthew Black, who together represent the mainstream position that the Book of Parables was composed in Jewish circles within 100 years on either side of the turn of the Common Era, and simply was not present in the particular library at Qumran, either because that community rejected it or because the copy or copies they possessed were among the many manuscripts that did not survive. The complete Book of Parables survives in Ge'ez, in the Ethiopian tradition. The Ge'ez manuscripts derive from a Greek intermediate text that circulated in the eastern Mediterranean during the 2nd and 3rd centuries of the Common Era, when Christian communities in Egypt and the Levant still read Enoch alongside the books that would eventually be included in the New Testament. The Greek text of Enoch survives only in fragments, the largest of which is preserved in the Chester Beatty collection in Dublin and covers portions of chapters 97 through 107. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church received the Ge'ez translation, made from the Greek, sometime between the 4th and 6th centuries of the Common Era, and preserved it continuously from that point forward. When Dr. Ephraim Isaac produced the standard modern English translation from the Ethiopian manuscripts for the Doubleday Old Testament pseudepigrapha edited by James Charlesworth in 1983, he was translating a text that had been copied by hand in the highlands of Ethiopia for approximately 15 centuries without external correction, and that preserves readings. The Aramaic fragments confirm where the two sources overlap. Where they overlap, they agree. That is the finding of the last 5 decades of Enoch scholarship, and it is the reason the Aksum manuscripts are treated with the seriousness they now receive. The Ethiopian tradition was not composing new material. It was transmitting an ancient one. The chapters that describe the 4 hollow places of the dead, the storehouse of the spirits, the return of the breath to bodies being prepared, and the sorting of the humble for their assignments on the earth are not later additions inserted into an old book. They are the old book. The Council of Laodicea, in the year 364, did not remove speculation. It removed a doctrine that had been on the page for 6 centuries at minimum by the time the bishops assembled. The Council of Laodicea assembled at some point between the years 363 and 365 of the Common Era in the Phrygian city that gave the council its name. The exact date is disputed because the acta of the council survive only in later copies that reproduce the canons without dating the assembly precisely, but every serious historian of the 4th century church places the meeting within that window. The council was a regional synod, not an ecumenical one. Its authority extended to the churches of Asia Minor, and the 60 canons it issued dealt primarily with matters of church discipline, liturgy, and the relationship between Christian congregations and the surviving Jewish communities of the region. Among those 60 canons, 2 are of decisive importance for the history of the Book of Enoch. Canon 59 states that no private psalms and no uncanonical books may be read in the church, only the canonical writings of the Old and New Testaments. Canon 60 supplies the list. The list in Canon 60 contains 22 books of the Old Testament and 26 of the New. The 22 Old Testament books correspond to the Hebrew canon as it had been received by the Greek-speaking Christian communities of the Eastern Mediterranean by the middle of the 4th century. Enoch is not among them, neither is Jubilees. Neither is any of the pseudepigraphic material that had circulated freely in the earlier centuries when Christian writers such as the author of the Letter of Jude quoted Enoch by name and treated its account of the fallen watchers as authoritative. The canons of Laodicea are the point at which the Latin and Greek churches formally and jointly closed the canonical list against Enoch. The Ethiopian church, which was not represented at Laodicea, and which received its scripture through the church at Alexandria before Alexandria itself accepted the Laodicean list, retained Enoch. Every other Christian communion west of the Ethiopian highlands eventually did not. The reasons the 4th century councils removed Enoch were not stated in the canons themselves. The canons state the result. The reasoning has to be reconstructed from the writings of the men who defended the removal in the decades that followed. The two writers whose defense of the removal proved most consequential were Jerome, who was completing his Latin translation of the Bible at the request of Pope Damasus during the years the Laodicean canons were being disseminated westward, and Augustine of Hippo, whose City of God became the standard reference for what the Latin Church would and would not accept as authoritative teaching about the afterlife. Jerome addressed the question of Enoch in his letter to Paulinus, Bishop of Nola, sometime around the year 394. The letter is preserved in the standard editions of Jerome's correspondence under the number 53, and in a section discussing what the Latin reader should and should not treat as scripture, Jerome notes that the Book of Enoch and the Apocalypse of Elijah, along with several other pseudepigraphic works, are to be counted among the Apocrypha. His stated reason is not that the books are false. His stated reason is that the authorship attributed to them cannot be verified, and that the doctrines they contain, in particular the doctrines concerning the fallen watchers and the movement of souls between the world of the living and the world of the dead, are inconsistent with what the Latin canon had by that point decided was the correct teaching. Jerome does not name the doctrine of soul return in that letter. He names the general category of teachings about the movement of souls, and he places Enoch among the sources that transmit those teachings. Augustine addressed the same question at length in Book 15 of the City of God, which he completed in approximately the year 420. Chapter 23 of that book takes up specifically the question of what the Book of Enoch teaches. And Augustine writes that although the book contains material that some earlier writers treated as inspired, the material cannot be accepted into the Latin canon because it contradicts the settled teaching of the Church on two specific points. The first point is the identification of the fallen watchers with the sons of God mentioned in the 6th chapter of Genesis, which Augustine argues was a misreading. The second point is the account the book gives of what happens to souls after death, which Augustine describes as a doctrine that could not be reconciled with the emerging consensus that the soul at death goes directly either to the presence of God or to the place of punishment without intermediate stages and without return. Augustine does not deny that Enoch was a real person. He denies that the book bearing his name transmits an accurate account of what Enoch actually taught. And on that basis, he supports the removal that the Laodicean canons had by that point already accomplished. Athanasius of Alexandria issued his 39th festal letter in the year 367, 3 years after the Laodicean Synod, and that letter contains what most scholars treat as the first authoritative statement from a major see of what the New Testament canon was to contain. Athanasius also excluded Enoch. His stated reason was similar to the reason later given by Augustine. The book contained material that had been used by heretical groups, and although the book itself might not be heretical, its association with such groups made it unsuitable for public reading. Athanasius was writing in Greek from Alexandria, the city from which the Ethiopian church had received its faith and its scriptures a generation earlier. The Ethiopian church did not follow him on Enoch. That decision, made in the 4th century and never subsequently reversed, is the reason a reader today can walk into the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion in Aksum and be shown a manuscript of a book that in every other Christian tradition was systematically removed. The removal was not gentle. Copies of Enoch that had been in Christian hands in Egypt, Syria, and Asia Minor during the 2nd and 3rd centuries were withdrawn from public reading after Laodicea, then withdrawn from monastic libraries during the 5th century, then destroyed or allowed to decay during the 6th and 7th centuries, as the Byzantine and eventually the Islamic conquest reshaped the surviving Christian communities of the Eastern Mediterranean. By the time the Islamic scholar Ibn al-Nadim compiled his catalogue of books available in the libraries of Baghdad in the 10th century, Enoch had disappeared from the Christian bookstalls of the East so completely that al-Nadim could report only that certain sectarian Christian communities in Ethiopia and southern Arabia were said to preserve a book of that name. The bookstalls of Constantinople no longer had it. The libraries of Antioch no longer had it. The monasteries of Egypt, which had once produced the Greek translation that the JS was translated from, no longer had it. Enoch survived at Aksum and in the cave, 4 fragments buried at Qumran, and nowhere else in the world that any modern scholar has ever confirmed. James Bruce, the Scottish traveler and diplomat, arrived in Ethiopia in the year 1770 and spent 5 years there, attempting to locate the sources of the Blue Nile. He also, as an educated Presbyterian who had read enough of the Church Fathers to know what he was looking for, requested access to the ecclesiastical libraries of Gondar and of Aksum, and from those libraries he acquired 3 GES manuscripts of Enoch. Bruce brought them back to Britain in 1773. Of those 3, he deposited one in the Bodleian Library at Oxford, one in the Royal Library that eventually became part of the British Library, and one in his own private collection. Richard Lawrence, the Archbishop of Cashel, published the first English translation from the Bodleian manuscript in 1821. That translation is the reason any English speaker reading Enoch today can read it at all. Everything the modern English reader knows about the doctrine the Council of Laodicea removed comes back, through translation after translation, to those 3 manuscripts that Bruce carried out of the Highlands, and to the fragments Millik reconstructed from the caves near Qumran. In the winter of 1946, a Bedouin shepherd of the Ta'amira tribe, tending his goats on the western shore of the Dead Sea, threw a stone into the mouth of a cave he had passed 100 times before. The stone struck what he heard as pottery, and when he entered the cave he found jars, and when the jars were opened they contained parchment scrolls that no one alive at that moment recognized. Those scrolls, sold first to the Bethlehem antiquities dealer known as Kondo, and eventually transferred through a chain of intermediaries to the Palestinian Archaeological Museum in Jerusalem, turned out to be the first documented recovery of a library that had been sealed inside the cliffs above the Wadi Qumran for approximately 2,000 years. What was in the first cave was the beginning. Over the 11 years that followed, 10 additional caves in the same cliff face were surveyed, excavated, and catalogued. The most important of them was Cave 4. Cave 4 was located in September of 1952, and it contained fragments of somewhere between 500 and 600 separate manuscripts. Almost none of the fragments were intact scrolls. Most were pieces the size of a thumbnail, some the size of a palm, a few the size of a page. The team assembling them worked in a room in the Palestinian Archaeological Museum for 2 decades, matching handwriting to handwriting and script to script, trying to reconstruct what the library had originally held. Among the fragments assigned to Cave 4 were 11 separate manuscripts of the Book of Enoch, catalogued sequentially as 4Q 201 through 4Q 212, with one number in the sequence assigned to a related but distinct composition. The 11 Enoch manuscripts represent the largest concentration of Enochic material ever recovered from a single ancient site. Joseph Millik, the Polish priest and specialist in Aramaic paleography who had been assigned the Enoch material in 1955, spent the next 20 years working on it. His methodology combined paleographic dating, which places each fragment in a particular script style associated with a particular period, with careful matching of overlapping passages against the GES text preserved at Aksum. The results were published by the Clarendon Press at Oxford in 1976 in a single volume titled The Books of Enoch. The volume contained transcriptions of all 11 Aramaic manuscripts, paleographic analyses, dating them across a range from the late 3rd century before the Common Era to the middle of the 1st century of the Common Era, and commentary on how the Aramaic and GES texts related to each other where both survived. The oldest of the manuscripts, catalogued as 4Q 208, contains portions of the astronomical book and dates paleographically to somewhere in the late 3rd or early 2nd century before the Common Era. This is significant for 2 reasons. It confirms that the astronomical book existed in written form at least 200 years before the composition of the New Testament, and it demonstrates that the astronomical material Enoch attributes to the tour Uriel gave him was preserved with substantially the same content across a period of 3 centuries between its Aramaic composition and its GZ. Translation. The Ethiopian tradition was not inventing the astronomical material. The tradition was transmitting it. 4Q 201 and 4Q 202, both dated to the 2nd century before the Common Era, contain portions of the Book of the Watchers, and among the passages preserved in these 2 manuscripts are fragments of chapter 22, the chapter that describes the 4 hollow places of the dead. The relevant passage in 4Q 202 preserves the Aramaic construction that the GES text translates as the 4 hollow places, and the 2 versions match in their description of the sorting of the dead into distinct compartments. The Aramaic uses the word makom, place, and modifies it with a construction indicating hollowness or emptiness, meaning a carved-out chamber rather than a natural depression. The compartments are distinguished from one another by function. and the function of each is specified in language that the Ge'ez preserves with fidelity. 4Q 204 contains fragments of the Epistle of Enoch, including portions of chapter 103 and chapter 108, the two chapters at the end of the compilation that describe the return of souls to earthly bodies and the sorting of the humble spirits for their assignments. The relevant passages are fragmentary but sufficient to establish that the doctrine of soul return was present in the Aramaic tradition before the turn of the Common Era. The Ethiopian tradition did not add it later. The doctrine was there in the 2nd and 1st centuries before the Common Era, in the same library where the Book of the Community Rule and the War Scroll and the Damascus document were also preserved, in the collection assembled by the community whose members lived at the settlement above the caves during those centuries. The Book of Parables, chapters 37 through 71 of the Ethiopian text, is not represented in the Cave 4 material. That absence became the basis of Melik's argument, published in his 1976 volume, that the Book of Parables was a Christian composition post-dating the Qumran community. The argument was received with considerable skepticism from the beginning and has since been rejected by the mainstream of Enoch scholarship. George Nicholsburg's Hermeneia commentary on the Book of Parables, published in 2011 as the second volume of the two-volume Hermeneia Enoch, argues on the basis of internal evidence that the Book of Parables was composed in Jewish circles in the region of Galilee at some point in the last decades before the Common Era or the earliest decades after it. James Vanderkam has argued similar dating on independent grounds. John Collins in his study of the Enochic corpus has argued the same. Michael Stone in his work on Second Temple pseudepigrapha has argued the same. Matthew Black in his translation and commentary on the Book of Enoch has argued the same. The consensus, insofar as the field has one, is that the Book of Parables was Jewish, was ancient, and was simply not present in the specific library that survived at Qumran. The doctrines it contains were not invented by later Christian editors. The doctrines were preserved by the Ethiopian tradition from a Jewish source that the Qumran library did not happen to preserve. The three chapters this account will spend the most time on, chapters 39, 41, and 61, are all from the Book of Parables. That means the Aramaic originals of these chapters have not been recovered. What survives is the Ge'ez translation, made from the Greek intermediate text, made from the Aramaic source. The Ge'ez is what the Aksum manuscripts preserve. The Ge'ez is what Ephraim Isaac translated for the Charlesworth Old Testament pseudepigrapha edition, and the Ge'ez, on the internal evidence, preserves a Jewish tradition of the last decades before the Common Era, transmitted through Greek and into Ethiopian, without substantial modification of the doctrinal content the tradition carried. Where corroboration is possible, it comes from the two chapters this account has already named. Chapter 22 is preserved in Aramaic in 4Q 202. Chapter 103 is preserved in Aramaic in 4Q 204. Both of these Aramaic fragments date from before the turn of the Common Era. Both describe the treatment of the dead and the movement of souls in language that the Ge'ez of chapters 39, 41, and 61 develops and extends. The material is not late. The material is not Christian. The material was present in the Judean library at Qumran 200 years before Jerome, and the doctrine it teaches is the doctrine the Latin canon subsequently declined to preserve. The 7 teachings that this account will reconstruct follow the order in which the material appears in the compilation, as the Ethiopian tradition arranged it. The first teaching is drawn from chapter 22, the 4 hollow places of the dead. The second teaching is drawn from chapter 39, the dwelling of the righteous departed. The third teaching, the central one, is drawn from chapter 41, the storehouse of the spirits, and the mechanism by which the storehouse operates. The fourth teaching is drawn from chapter 61, the return of the breath to bodies being prepared on the earth. The fifth is drawn from chapter 103, the promise made to the spirits of the righteous who died in sorrow. The sixth is drawn from chapter 108, the sorting of the humble for their assignments. And the seventh is drawn from a passage that stitches the whole account together, chapter 69, which names the entity who transmitted the sworn oath under which the return of souls is regulated and preserved in a hidden name Enoch is told to record. Each teaching contains a piece of the doctrine that the Council of Laodicea removed. Each teaching corresponds to a passage the Ethiopian tradition preserved, and each teaching has parallel material in either the Aramaic cave, 4 fragments, or the Egyptian and Babylonian sources that predate Enoch by centuries and describe the same mechanism in the language of a different tradition. The 7 together produce a picture of the afterlife that is not the picture the Latin canon transmits. The 7 together produce the picture the Aksum manuscript preserves. And the seven together produce, when read against the modern evidence for what happens to the body at death and what has been claimed to happen to consciousness in the interval between the cessation of the brain and the return of the pulse, a set of correspondences that this account will draw out at each stage without asserting that the ancient tradition and the modern evidence are describing the same thing. They may be, they may not be. The account will present what each source says. The reader will decide what to do with the fact that the sources agree on more than they should. Chapter 22 of the Book of the Watchers opens with a formula the Book of the Watchers uses repeatedly to introduce a scene of instruction. Enoch writes that he was taken from that place to another place, and that in the other place he was shown something new. The place in question is described as a great mountain in the far west of the world. The Ge'ez word rendered in the standard English editions as the west is the compound merab, meaning the place of the setting of the sun. The mountain is described as reaching high enough to touch the lower structure of the sky. Its interior, Enoch writes, was hollowed out into 4 separate chambers, and the chambers were arranged with a specific geometry the text records. 3 of the 4 chambers were dark. The 4th was lit from within by a source Enoch does not identify. The messenger accompanying Enoch on the tour is named in verse 3 of the chapter. The messenger is Raphael, one of the 4 archangels who appear repeatedly in the Book of the Watchers as the guides to specific portions of the tour. Raphael is described in chapter 10 as the messenger sent by God to bind the fallen watcher Azazel in the desert of Dudal, and by chapter 22 Raphael has become the guide who shows Enoch the interior of the mountain where the dead are held. The consistency of Raphael's role across the 2 chapters is one of the internal features that argues for the unity of the Book of the Watchers as a single composition rather than a compilation of unrelated fragments. What Raphael shows Enoch inside the mountain is the sorting of the dead. The dead are sorted into the 4 chambers according to what they did in life and what has been decided about them by the entity Enoch calls, in the standard Ge'ez, the Lord of Spirits. That title, Marmanafstat in Ge'ez, is used repeatedly throughout the Book of Parables, to refer to the entity that presides over the storehouse of spirits and over the return of the breath to bodies. In the Book of the Watchers, the title appears less frequently, but at chapter 22, verse 14, it appears in reference to the entity who assigned the sorting principle by which the 4 chambers are populated. The sorting principle is the first teaching this account will address. Before that teaching can be examined, the reader has to understand one thing about the Ge'ez word being translated in the standard English editions as chamber. The word is not the word for a room in a house. It is the word for a hollow made in the rock, a cavity, a place with walls that are not built but carved. The 4 hollow places in the Ge'ez are 4 places where something has been removed from the rock to make room for what is now being held there. Nothing about the wording suggests a natural formation. Everything about the wording suggests deliberate construction, done at some point before Enoch's tour by an entity capable of hollowing out a mountain. The tour of the 4 chambers takes 6 verses to describe. Enoch records who is in each chamber, what condition they are in, why they were placed there, and what will happen to them at the end. The reader who has been raised in the framework the Latin canon transmits will recognize some of what Enoch describes and will find some of it entirely unfamiliar. The souls of the righteous are held in 1 chamber. The souls of the sinners who were not punished on earth are held in a 2nd. The souls of those who were murdered and whose blood cries out for justice are held in a 3rd. The souls of those who died in sin, but whose sin was less than the sin of the 2nd category, are held in a 4th. Those distinctions are broadly recognizable. What is not recognizable is what the chambers do while the souls are held there, and what the souls do while they are inside, and what happens to the souls when their time in the chambers is complete. Those questions are answered by chapter 22 of the Book of the Watchers, and the answers are the first teaching. The answers describe a system of the dead that is neither the Sheol of the Hebrew Bible nor the heaven and hell of the Latin canon. The system is something else, and its mechanism is what this account is now going to reconstruct. Before the first teaching is examined in detail, the reader who has followed the account this far should be told what to watch for. The 7 teachings do not stand alone, they interlock. The first teaching, the 4 chambers, establishes the geometry of the system by which the dead are held. The 2nd and 3rd teachings, the dwelling of the righteous and the storehouse of the spirits, describe what the dead do while they are held. The 4th teaching, the return of the breath, describes the mechanism by which the holding is temporary. The 5th and 6th teachings, the promise to the sorrowful and the sorting of the humble, describe why the return happens and what determines the assignment given to each returned soul on the earth to which it is sent. The 7th teaching, the hidden name and the sworn oath, describes the entity who regulates the whole process and the guarantee that the process cannot be interrupted from outside. Read in sequence. The 7 teachings produce an account of the afterlife that is systematic in the sense a working engineer would recognize. The Enochic corpus treats the entire structure of creation as a single working mechanism, and the treatment of the dead is one part of the mechanism, integrated with the other parts, running on the same principles as the movement of water through the reservoirs of the heights and the paths of the sun through the gates of the horizon. The reader who begins with the 4 chambers and follows through to the sorting of the humble will find that the whole picture emerges without any single teaching having to carry the doctrine alone. Each teaching supplies a piece. The pieces fit. And before we go further, I need to pause for a second, because what I'm about to tell you gets significantly darker. And I realized a while ago that some of this cannot be fully explained in a video format. The complete reconstruction of the doctrine of soul returned the Council of Laodicea removed from Christian scripture in 364 the specific mechanism Enoch describes for how the dead power, the ongoing structure of creation, the numbered chambers, Uriel showed Enoch, and the passages that name each one in sequence, the exact wording of Jerome's letter to Paulinus explaining why the Enochic material could not be permitted in the Latin canon. I put it all into a written document. It's linked below, and the QR code is on your screen. Now let's continue. The first teaching begins with the interior of the mountain. Chapter 22 of the Book of the Watchers describes what Enoch saw when Raphael took him into the 4 hollow places, and the description follows a strict order that the Ge'ez text preserves and that the Aramaic fragment at Cave 4 confirms in the portions where the 2 overlap. Enoch is shown the first chamber. He is told what is in it. He asks a question. Raphael answers. Enoch is then shown the second chamber, and the same pattern repeats. The pattern repeats a third and a fourth time. At the end of the tour, Enoch summarizes what he has been shown, and the chapter closes with a formula that will reappear in chapter 41 when the storehouse of the spirits is introduced. The formula is a promise. The promise is that the sorting is not permanent. Each of the 4 categories of the dead will be dealt with, and dealt with in a specific way, at a specific time, by a specific entity. Nothing about the account suggests that the dead are simply waiting for a final judgment that will end their existence one way or the other. Everything about the account suggests that the dead are participants in a process that is already underway. The first chamber, in the order Enoch describes it, contains the souls of the righteous who died in the fear of the Lord of Spirits. Verse 9 of the chapter identifies this category and specifies that a bright spring is in the chamber. The bright spring is a detail the standard English translations tend to render blandly, but the Ge'ez word being translated is Manba Brahman, a compound that combines the word for a source or fountain with the word for light. The bright spring is not simply an illuminating feature. It is a working element of the chamber. The souls of the righteous are held near it. They are, according to the wording, sustained by it. The Ge'ez verb, rendered by Isaac in the standard English as being with the spring, carries a connotation of drawing from a source, of being nourished by a supply that is being continuously replenished. The souls of the righteous, in this account, are not asleep in a dark holding place. They are near a working light source, drawing from it whatever it is that the source supplies. The second chamber contains the souls of the sinners whose sin was of a specific kind. The Ge'ez text specifies that these are the souls of those who died, having sinned without having been punished for the sin on the earth. Their death was ordinary. Their judgment was postponed. And their souls are held in this chamber, awaiting the day of judgment, at which point they will be brought forward and their sentence will be pronounced. The Ge'ez word for this chamber, unlike the word for the first, does not include any element indicating light or nourishment. The chamber is described as dark and separated. The souls in it are held in a condition of waiting that the text explicitly distinguishes from the condition in the first chamber. The 2 conditions are not the same. The distinction between them is not simply a difference of moral status. It is a difference of function. The third chamber contains the souls of those who were murdered and whose blood was not avenged. This is the category that produces the most distinctive language in the chapter. Verse 12 records that the souls of the murdered cry out from the chamber. Their cry is heard, and it is heard by the entity Enoch calls the Lord of Spirits, and the cry is described as continuing until the day when the murderers themselves are brought to judgment. The Aramaic fragment at Cave 4 preserves a piece of this passage, and the piece uses a construction rendered in the Ge'ez as the voice of the blood, an idiom that also appears in the Hebrew Bible in the account of Cain and Abel in the 4th chapter of Genesis. The construction is a survival of an older tradition, one that predates the Book of the Watchers and that treats the blood of the murdered as an active presence with a voice that reaches the throne of the entity who administers the judgment of the world. The fourth chamber contains the souls of those who died in sin but whose sin was of a lesser degree than the sin of the second category. The distinction between the second and fourth chambers is one of the most disputed passages in the modern commentary on Enoch. Ephraim Isaac in his 1983 translation notes that the Ge'ez text preserves a distinction that later manuscripts sometimes smooth over, and that the distinction is between those who were sinners in a decisive way and those who were sinners in a mixed way. The souls in the fourth chamber are described as being held, but not being punished. They are not, according to the text, in the same condition as the second category. They are being sorted for a different outcome. What that outcome is, the chapter does not fully specify, but the wording strongly implies that the outcome is not a final destination. The wording implies that the souls of the fourth chamber will be released, at some point, for a further stage in the process, and that the further stage will involve their return to something. This last point is the pivot of the first teaching, and it is the point at which the Enochic account diverges most sharply from what the Latin canon eventually taught. In the framework, the Latin canon transmits, the dead go to heaven, they go to purgatory, or they go to hell, and once they arrive, they remain. In the framework, chapter 22 of Enoch describes, the dead are held in the four hollow places, and the four hollow places are not their final destination, they are stations. The souls in them are being processed. The processing has stages. The stages will be described in the later chapters of Enoch, chapters 39 and 41 and 61 and 103 and 108. Chapter 22 establishes the geometry within which the processing occurs. The remaining chapters describe what happens inside that geometry. The Ge'ez text of chapter 22 contains one detail that the standard English translations tend to underweight. In verse 11, describing the chamber of the righteous, the text records that the souls of the righteous participate in something. The Ge'ez verb is te'amara, which carries a range of meanings, including to be shown, to be revealed, and to be established as a witness to. The souls of the righteous, in the wording of verse 11, are participating in a witnessing that the chapter does not further specify. The witnessing is happening in the chamber. The souls are the ones doing it, and the standard English translations tend to render the verb as a simple statement of location rather than as a description of activity. Isaac renders it more carefully. The Ethiopian tradition, when the passage is read aloud in the liturgy on the days when Enoch is read, treats the phrase as a description of active service. The souls of the righteous, in the first chamber, are not simply being kept, they are working. What they are working at, the chapter does not fully explain, and the explanation will not come until chapter 41, when the storehouse of the spirits is introduced, and the mechanism by which the souls work is described in detail. The four chambers, then, are the framework. The framework has interior features that are not the same in each chamber. The framework has a working element in the first chamber, the bright spring, that has no counterpart in the other three. The framework has a working activity in the first chamber, the witnessing, that has no explicit counterpart in the other three. And the framework has an intended outcome for each of the four categories of souls, an outcome that the chapter identifies as future but describes as certain, and an outcome that the later chapters of Enoch will specify in progressively more detail until, at chapter 61, the outcome for at least some of the souls in the fourth chamber is named directly. The outcome is return. The souls of the fourth chamber, and possibly the souls of the second, will be sent back down to the earth. The mechanism will be described in chapter 41. The reason will be described in chapter 61. The account of the first teaching, chapter 22, is the map. The rest of the 7 teachings are the instructions for how the map is used. There is one further element of chapter 22 that has to be addressed before the second teaching can be introduced. The chapter records that Enoch asked Raphael a specific question about the sorting. Enoch asked why the chambers were 4 in number, and not 3, and not 5. Raphael's answer is preserved in the Ge'ez text of verse 13. The number 4, Raphael tells Enoch, corresponds to the 4 kinds of decision that the Lord of Spirits has made concerning the dead, and each kind of decision requires its own chamber, because the processes that will be applied to the souls in each category are different, and the processes cannot be applied to souls in the wrong category. The chambers are, in Raphael's answer, functional. They are not simply categories. They are the environments in which the specific processes are carried out. The processes cannot be run in the wrong chamber. The souls in the wrong chamber would not be processed correctly. The number 4 is the number of processes, not the number of moral distinctions. Raphael's answer, preserved in the Ge'ez and confirmed in the small Aramaic fragment that Milik reconstructed from 4Q 202, is the earliest surviving statement of a functional theory of the afterlife in the Jewish tradition. The dead, in this theory, are being subjected to procedures. The procedures have requirements. The requirements determine the geometry. 4 processes, 4 chambers. The first teaching, in summary, is this. The dead are sorted into 4 hollow places. The sorting is done by function, not by simple moral category. Each chamber is designed to carry out a specific procedure on the souls held within it. The first chamber contains a working light source. The souls in the first chamber are participating in an activity that the text describes as witnessing. And the sorting is not permanent, because the procedures being carried out will terminate, and when they terminate, the souls will be moved to whatever comes next. Chapter 22 does not specify what comes next for each of the 4 categories. It specifies only that something comes next, and that the something is different for each. The remaining teachings will fill in the specifics. The framework, however, is complete. The dead are in a working system. The system has procedures. The procedures are ongoing, and nothing about the account allows the modern reader to treat the 4 chambers as a passive holding place. The chambers are, in the Ge'ez wording that the Ethiopian tradition preserves, active. What is active about them is what the second teaching will describe. The second teaching begins where the first teaching ended. The 4 chambers are the framework. The souls held within them are, in the wording of chapter 22, participating in activities that the chapter names but does not describe. Chapter 39 of the Book of Parables is the chapter that describes what one of those activities actually is, and the description is preserved in the Ge'ez text of the Aksum manuscripts because the Book of Parables is the section of the Enochic corpus that survives most completely in the Ethiopian tradition. Chapter 39 opens with Enoch describing a further stage of his tour. He has been shown the 4 chambers of the dead in chapter 22. He has been shown the paths of the sun and the moon in chapters 72 through 82. And in chapter 39 he is taken to a different location, a location that the text distinguishes carefully from the 4 chambers. The location is called, in the Ge'ez, Mekan Sadekan, the dwelling of the righteous. The distinction between the 4 chambers and the dwelling is one of the interpretive puzzles that has occupied Enoch scholarship for 2 centuries, and Nickelsburg's Hermeneia commentary devotes an extended note to the question. The consensus that has emerged, and that Isaac's translation reflects, is that the 4 chambers are the initial holding places for the dead, and that the dwelling described in chapter 39 is a further location to which the souls of the righteous are moved after their time in the first chamber is complete. The dwelling is not the same as the first chamber. It is a promotion. What the dwelling contains, according to Enoch, is a different kind of activity than the witnessing that was happening in the first chamber. The souls in the dwelling are described in verse 4 as being with the messengers, participating in what the messengers are doing. The messengers are not further specified in that verse, but the Ge'ez word is manifestat, the same word used elsewhere in the Book of Parables for the entities who serve at the throne of the Lord of Spirits and who carry out the maintenance of the sky. The souls of the righteous, in this account, are not simply near these entities, they are working with them. They are participating in what the entities are doing. And what the entities are doing is described in the same chapter, at verses 7 through 12, as the ongoing maintenance of the structure of the world. The verses in question describe 6 activities that the messengers are carrying out at any given moment. The maintenance of the paths of the sun, so that the sun rises and sets in the correct positions at the correct times. The maintenance of the paths of the moon, so that the phases proceed in the correct order and the intercalation between the solar and lunar years is preserved. The maintenance of the storehouses of the winds, so that the winds are released in the correct proportions from the 12 gates. The maintenance of the storehouses of the waters above and below, so that the rains fall in the correct measure and the seas remain within their correct boundaries. The maintenance of the courses of the stars, so that the stars appear at their appointed times and follow their appointed tracks. And the maintenance of what the text calls the boundaries between the categories of the created, so that what belongs above remains above and what belongs below remains below. Those 6 activities are the maintenance of creation. The Enochic account treats them not as things that happen automatically once God has spoken, but as things that require continuous work, carried out by named entities, in a system with parts that would fail if the work stopped. The souls of the righteous, in chapter 39, are described as participating in this work. They are not the messengers themselves, but they are working alongside the messengers at tasks the messengers assign and their participation in the work is what the dwelling is for. The dwelling is not a reward in the passive sense that the word reward carries in most modern religious writing. The dwelling is an assignment. The souls of the righteous are being deployed. This is the second teaching in its core form. The dead are working. Some of the dead are working. The souls of the righteous, once they have completed their time in the first chamber and have been moved to the dwelling, are participating in the maintenance of the structure of the world. Their participation is described in the same language the Book of Parables uses for the participation of the messengers. Their tasks are not identified by name, but the general category of the tasks is clear. The tasks are the maintenance activities that keep the world running. The Gaze text of chapter 39 contains a further detail that the standard English translations often smooth over. In verse 13, describing what happens to the souls in the dwelling after they have participated in the maintenance work for a period of time, the text uses a phrase that Isaac renders as they were refreshed, drawing on a Jez verb that also carries the meaning of being restored to a previous condition or being replenished from its source. The souls in the dwelling are being refreshed by their work. The work does not deplete them. The work replenishes them. And the wording strongly suggests that the mechanism of the replenishment is the same mechanism that operates at the bright spring in the first chamber, the mechanism whose full description is postponed until chapter 41. Chapter 39 also contains one of the most quoted passages in the Book of Parables. Verse 3 records that Enoch, seeing the dwelling of the righteous and the activities of the messengers, was so overcome that his spirit was transported, and he was unable to remain in his ordinary condition. The passage has been read by generations of scholars as a mystical experience narrative, and Nicholsburg's commentary discusses at length the parallels between this passage and the visionary literature of the Second Temple period. What has been less discussed is the specific detail that Enoch, in this passage, is not simply seeing the dwelling from outside. He is inside it, or in a state of consciousness that allows him to perceive the interior activities in the same way the souls of the righteous themselves perceive them. The passage functions in the structure of the Book of Parables as a testimony from a living human being about what the working environment of the dead actually looks like from the inside. Enoch is the witness. His witnessing is why the second teaching survives. The passage continues in verse 4 with Enoch describing what he saw the souls of the righteous doing. They were praising, in a language he did not fully understand, but whose content he could partially follow. Alongside the praising, they were watching, keeping an eye on developments below them in the earth. And in a phrase the Geas preserves, and the standard English translations often render as intercession, the souls were presenting requests concerning specific matters on the earth to the entity Enoch calls the Lord of Spirits. The intercession is not a passive practice. It is the third activity of the souls of the righteous in the dwelling. They are, in Enoch's account, actively communicating with the entity at the throne on behalf of specific matters that concern the living. And their intercession, the passage implies, is one of the ways in which the maintenance work they participate in is directed towards specific effects on the earth. The three activities of the souls of the righteous in the dwelling, then, are praising, watching, and interceding. Those three activities are described in the Ge'ez as being carried out continuously, without interruption, in coordination with the 6 maintenance activities of the messengers. The souls of the righteous, in chapter 39, are integrated into a system that is running at all times, and the system's running produces observable effects on the earth. The paths of the sun and the moon are maintained. The winds are released in correct proportion. The rains fall in correct measure. And the messengers, working with the souls of the righteous, are responsible for the maintenance. That framework is one of the pieces of the Enochic doctrine that the Latin canon lost. In the framework the Latin canon transmits, the souls of the righteous are held in a state of blessedness that consists primarily of being in the presence of God. Deployment on tasks is not part of the standard Latin account. Integration into a working system is not part of it either. The souls in that framework are rewarded, not employed. Enoch's account is different. The reward, in Enoch's account, consists of being given something to do. The something is the maintenance of the world, and the doing of it replenishes the doer, so that the doing can continue. Chapter 39 ends with a passage that Enoch himself does not fully understand, and that Raphael, still his guide, does not fully explain to him. The passage describes a transition. The souls in the dwelling, at some point in their working, are moved further. They are moved to a location the text identifies as a storehouse. The storehouse is not further described in chapter 39. It is left as a name and a promise. The reader has to wait for chapter 41 for the description. And the description in chapter 41 is the third teaching, the one that names what the storehouse is, what it contains, and what happens inside it. The description in chapter 41 is the mechanism by which the dead, in the Enochic account, are said to power the ongoing structure of the world. Before that mechanism is examined, the reader should note one point about the transmission of the second teaching. The Aramaic Cave 4 fragments do not preserve chapter 39, because the Book of Parables is not present in the Cave 4 material. The second teaching depends on the Ge'ez text alone. That is a genuine limitation of the evidence, and it is one of the reasons the Book of Parables has been the subject of more disputed scholarship than any other section of the Enochic corpus. But the Ge'ez text of chapter 39 matches, in its handling of the dwelling of the righteous, the framework the Aramaic fragments of chapter 22 establish. The dwelling described in chapter 39 is compatible with the 4 chambers described in chapter 22. The activity assigned to the souls in the dwelling is compatible with the witnessing described as occurring in the first chamber. The system is internally consistent, and the internal consistency, in the absence of an Aramaic original, is the strongest argument that the Ge'ez chapter 39 preserves a tradition that was in the material before it was translated, rather than being an invention of the Ethiopian tradition itself. The second teaching, in summary, is this. The souls of the righteous, once their time in the first chamber of the 4 hollow places has been completed, are moved to a further location called the dwelling. In the dwelling they participate in 3 activities: praising and watching and interceding, and they participate alongside the messengers who are carrying out the 6 maintenance activities that keep the structure of the world running. The work does not deplete them, it refreshes them, and their participation in the work is one of the things the Latin canon lost when the Council of Laodicea removed the Book of Parables from the reading of the Church. The teaching survives at Aksum. The manuscript that preserves it sits in a cedar box in the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion. The doctrine that it teaches, that the righteous dead are integrated into the maintenance of creation, was on the page of a book Christian congregations in Egypt and the Levant read aloud on the Sabbath in the 2nd and 3rd centuries of the Common Era. That reading did not continue. The doctrine was one of the reasons. The third teaching is the passage this account has been building toward. Chapter 41 of the Book of Parables preserves the description of the storehouse of the spirits, and the description in chapter 41 is the passage that supplies the mechanism the first 2 teachings only pointed to. The first teaching established that the dead are sorted into 4 hollow places. The second teaching established that the souls of the righteous, once moved to the dwelling, participate in the maintenance of the world. The third teaching, in chapter 41, describes the working structure inside which the participation occurs, and the description makes clear that the participation is not a metaphor for the souls being pleased with themselves. The participation is a function performed by the souls that has measurable effects on the material of which the sky is constructed and the material out of which the earth is sustained. Chapter 41 opens with Enoch, describing what he was shown of the storehouses. The Ge'ez word for storehouse is medbe, a word that carries the concrete meaning of a warehouse, a supply depot, a place where materials are kept for issue on demand. Enoch is shown, in the first verses of the chapter, the storehouses of the winds. The winds are not free to blow in whatever direction they wish. They are kept in the storehouses, in measured quantities, and they are released in the correct proportions by the messengers who are assigned to the operation of the storehouse doors. The same passage describes the storehouses of the lightning, the storehouses of the thunder, the storehouses of the hail, the storehouses of the mist, and, in verses that Nickelsburg's commentary treats as central to the whole doctrine of the third teaching, the storehouses of the spirits and the storehouses of the breath. The storehouses of the spirits and of the breath are described in language that treats them as parallel to the storehouses of the winds. Both categories are places where a working substance is kept in measured quantity. Both categories are places from which the substance is released in correct proportion by the operation of the messengers assigned to them. The parallel is not accidental. The Ge'ez uses the same verbs for the intake, the retention, and the release of the wind and of the spirit. The 2 categories of storehouse are, in the wording of chapter 41, of the same kind. What the storehouses of the winds do for the atmosphere, the storehouses of the spirits do for something else. What the something else is, chapter 41 specifies in the passage that describes the return. The Ge'ez text of chapter 41 verse 8, in Isaac's translation, reads as follows in its plain meaning. The messenger showed Enoch how the spirits are received into the storehouses, and how they are retained there, and how, when the time appointed for them has been fulfilled, the spirits are released into the bodies that are being formed on the earth for their reception. The Aramaic cave. 4 fragments do not preserve chapter 41, so this passage is one of the sections that depends on the Jez alone. But the Jez is unambiguous. Spirits come into the storehouse, are held there for a period the text calls the appointed time, and are then released. The release does not go to an unspecified location. It goes into bodies. The bodies are being formed on the earth. The bodies are being prepared for the reception of the spirits that will be released into them. The doctrine is what the standard English translations tend to soften. The doctrine is the return of souls to material bodies on the earth. The Jez preserves it. The Ethiopian tradition reads it aloud on the days when Enoch is included in the liturgy. And the Council of Laodicea, in the year 364, removed the book that transmits it. That is the core of the third teaching in its narrowest form. Chapter 41 continues, however, and the continuation supplies the mechanism by which the storehouse is said to power the ongoing structure of creation. The storehouse, in Enoch's account, does not simply hold the spirits. The storehouse uses them. The spirits in the storehouse are described, in verses 9 through 12 of chapter 41, as a supply from which the working of the sky draws. The verb the Jez uses is the verb for drawing water from a well or for drawing a supply from a reservoir. The paths of the sun and the moon, the operation of the winds, the falling of the rains, the growth of what grows on the earth, all of these processes are described as drawing on the storehouse of the spirits for the working substance they require. The souls of the dead, held in the storehouse, are the working substance. This is the passage that no Christian bishop after the year 400 could have quoted in a sermon without being censured. The Latin canon that emerged from the 4th century councils held that the material of the world was sustained by the direct action of God, unmediated, without intermediate structures, and that the dead had no functional role in that sustaining. Enoch's account does not deny that God sustains the world. Enoch's account describes the specific mechanism through which the sustaining is carried out, and the specific mechanism involves the dead. The dead are the supply. The messengers are the operators. God is the entity who owns the whole system and who has assigned the operators to run it. But the substance being drawn on for the sustaining is the substance the storehouse of the spirits contains, and the substance the storehouse of the spirits contains is the souls of those who have died. The Jez word for the substance being drawn on is naphas, which is the same word used in the 2nd chapter of Genesis for the breath God breathed into the nostrils of the first human being to make the human being a living soul. The naphas is not the personality of the dead. The naphas is what animates the body, the living principle, the working element that departs the body at the moment of death and is received into the storehouse. That is the substance the storehouse holds. That is the substance the working of the sky draws on. And the appointment of a period of retention, the appointed time, chapter 41 names, is the period during which the naphas is available for the sky to use. When the appointed time is complete, the naphas is released. Where it goes, chapter 41 has already specified. Into bodies, bodies being formed on the earth, for their reception. Nicolsburg's Hermeneia commentary on chapter 41 is careful about the language. He notes that the Jez does not use the vocabulary of soul return in the sense that later Greek philosophical traditions would use it. The chapter does not invoke reincarnation in the technical sense. What it invokes is a distinct doctrine, one that is closer in some ways to certain later Jewish mystical traditions concerning the transmigration of souls than it is to the classical Platonic doctrine, and that stands independently of both. The doctrine chapter 41 teaches is that the working substance of the sky is drawn from the storehouse of the spirits, that the storehouse is replenished by the intake of new spirits at death, and that the outflow from the storehouse is directed toward the bodies being formed on the earth at any given moment. The system is closed. Nothing is lost. The substance is conserved. It moves from body to storehouse to body again, in a cycle that is regulated by the messengers assigned to the operation of the storehouse doors, and the cycle is what keeps the sky running. The reader who has followed the account this far will recognize that this is not the doctrine the Latin canon transmits. But the reader may also recognize that the doctrine, in its structural features, corresponds to a set of ideas that survive in fragmentary form in other ancient traditions. The Egyptian concept of the Ka, the animating principle that leaves the body at death and returns to specific locations in the tomb and in the temples for the maintenance of the world of the living, is a related structure. The Babylonian concept of the Giddim, the shade of the dead that continues to function in the world below and whose maintenance requires offerings from the living, is a related structure. The concept in the Hebrew Bible of the Ruach, the breath or wind that animates living things and returns to God who gave it, is a related structure. All of these traditions treat the animating substance of the living as a substance that is conserved, that moves between locations, and that participates in the operation of larger systems. Enoch's account, in chapter 41, is the most systematic surviving version of this concept in any of the ancient sources, and chapter 41 is one of the passages the Latin canon lost. Chapter 41 contains one further detail that has to be examined before the third teaching can be summarized. Verse 14 of the chapter describes the messenger who operates the storehouse of the spirits, and the messenger is named. The name is Uriel. This is the same Uriel who conducted Enoch on the tour of the astronomical apparatus in chapters 72 through 82, the same Uriel who is described in chapter 20 as the messenger set over the world and over the storehouses of the underworld. The consistency of Uriel's role across the astronomical, mortuary, and pneumatological sections of the Enochic corpus is one of the internal features that argues for the coherence of the whole compilation. Uriel is the operator. Uriel manages the intake, the retention, and the release of the spirits from the storehouse. And Uriel is the messenger who tells Enoch what he is seeing in the same clinical language that Uriel used when describing the paths of the sun in the astronomical book. The correspondence between the two roles is not a coincidence. The Enochic account treats the operation of the sky and the operation of the storehouse of the spirits as parts of a single mechanism, and the operator of the mechanism, in both cases, is the same entity. The third teaching, in summary, is this: the souls of the dead are held in a storehouse. The storehouse is described in chapter 41 of the Book of Parables, in language that treats it as a working reservoir of a substance the sky draws on for its operation. The substance is the naphas, the animating principle, the breath that departs the body at death. The messengers who operate the sky draw on the storehouse for the substance they need to perform the 6 maintenance activities that keep the world running. The substance is released back to the earth after the appointed period of retention is complete, and the release is directed into bodies being formed at that moment on the earth for the reception of the released substance. The operator of the storehouse is the messenger Uriel. The system is closed, and the substance is conserved. And this account of the mechanism, preserved in the Ge'ez text of the Book of Parables at Aksum, is the passage on which the topic of this video most directly rests. The dead do power something. What they power is the maintenance of the sky. And the reason souls are sent back down, in this account, is that the storehouse must be periodically emptied of the substance whose retention has fulfilled its appointed period, so that new intake can be received, and the working cycle can continue. Chapter 41 does not use the modern vocabulary. Chapter 41 uses the language of a working depot with intake, retention, and release. But the mechanism the chapter describes is the mechanism the topic of this video names. Chapter 41 describes the mechanism. The reason souls are sent back down, in the framework Enoch presents, is a separate question, and the chapter answers it in the passage that follows the description of the storehouse operation. The storehouse, as chapter 41 has already established, is a working reservoir. Its retention capacity is limited. Its intake is continuous, because deaths are continuous on the earth, and its release, therefore, has to be continuous as well, because a reservoir with continuous intake and no release will eventually overflow. The mechanics of the reservoir are not the mechanics of an infinite space. The mechanics are the mechanics of a working system with intake, holding, and outflow, and the outflow has to occur at a rate that matches the intake, or the system fails. That is the structural reason for the return. It is preserved in chapter 41, verses 15 through 18, and it is preserved in language that Nickelsburg's commentary identifies as an argument rather than as a simple description. The argument runs as follows. If the storehouse held all the spirits ever received without any release, the storehouse would eventually be unable to receive more, and if the storehouse became unable to receive more, the intake would fail. And if the intake failed, the working of the sky would lose its supply of the substance it draws on for the maintenance activities, and if the maintenance activities stopped, the structure of the world would fail. The release is therefore necessary. The release preserves the capacity of the intake. The intake preserves the supply available to the sky. The supply available to the sky preserves the maintenance activities, and the maintenance activities preserve the structure. The system runs because the release occurs. That is the structural reason. Chapter 41 also names a second reason, which is a functional one rather than a structural one. The souls of the dead, in the account chapter 41 gives, are not simply substance. Each individual soul, according to the chapter, has a role for which it was originally created, and that role is not always completed in the lifetime during which the soul was first embodied. Some souls die with their role incomplete. Others die in circumstances that prevented the role from beginning at all. A third category dies at ages so young that no role could yet have been assigned in the ordinary way. And the storehouse, in Enoch's account, holds those souls until conditions on the earth are appropriate for the role to be completed. When the conditions are appropriate, the soul is released. The release is not random. The release is targeted. In the same way the release of a wind from a storehouse of the winds is targeted to a specific direction and a specific season. Each soul, when it is released for a particular purpose, and the purpose corresponds to the role the soul was originally created to fulfill. The Jay's word Isaac renders as role is teker, a compound that carries the concrete meaning of an assigned position, an office, a responsibility that has been given to a specific individual. The word is used elsewhere in the Book of Parables for the positions assigned to the messengers, and it is used in the Book of the Watchers for the positions the fallen watchers abandoned when they descended to Mount Hermon. The word does not mean role in the vague modern sense of a general purpose in life. The word means a specific assignment, given by a specific authority, with specific requirements that have to be met before the assignment can be considered complete. The souls held in the storehouse, in the wording of chapter 41, have such assignments. The assignments were given when the souls were originally created. The assignments were not completed in the lifetime during which the soul was first embodied, and the storehouse retains the soul until the conditions on the earth are such that the assignment can be resumed and completed. That is the second reason for the return. The soul returns because the assignment has not been completed. Some souls, according to the chapter, return once. Others return more than once. A soul that completes its assignment on a single return is moved into the dwelling of the righteous and integrated into the maintenance activities described in chapter 39. A soul that fails on the return to complete the assignment is returned to the storehouse and held for another period, and then released again into another body being prepared for another opportunity. The chapter does not put an upper limit on the number of times a soul may be returned. The chapter puts no limit at all. The system runs until the assignment is complete, and then the soul moves into the second phase of its existence, which is the phase described in chapter 39 as participation in the maintenance work. The reader who has been raised in the framework the Latin canon transmits will recognize immediately how different this is from the doctrine that the Latin canon eventually taught. In the standard Latin account, each human being has one life on the earth, and the outcome of that life determines the eternal destination of the soul. The framework does not include a mechanism by which the soul can return for a second attempt at completing an assignment. The framework does not include a mechanism by which souls can be held in a reservoir from which the working of the sky draws. And the framework does not include the specific detail chapter 41 supplies, that some souls have originally created assignments that require more than one lifetime to complete, and that the system is designed to provide those souls with the additional lifetimes required. The Council of Laodicea in 364 did not name this doctrine as such in the canons it issued. The council removed the book that contained it and replaced the reading of that book in the churches with a shorter list that did not transmit the material. But the writings of Jerome, and later of Augustine, make clear that the doctrine of the storehouse and the return was one of the specific reasons the book was removed. Jerome, in his commentary on the 16th chapter of Isaiah, refers to the Enochic doctrine of the movement of spirits between the storehouse and the bodies as one of the errors that Christian teaching had to be protected from, and he cites Enoch specifically as the book in which the error is preserved. Augustine, in Book 15, chapter 23 of the City of God, addresses the doctrine at greater length and argues that the doctrine cannot be reconciled with the settled teaching of the Church, because the settled teaching held that each soul is created at the moment of conception and that no soul pre-exists the body it is born into. Enoch's chapter 41 holds that the souls pre-exist the bodies, that the souls are held in the storehouse between embodiments, and that the release from the storehouse is what animates the body being formed for the reception of the soul that is being released. The two doctrines are incompatible. Augustine chose the doctrine of one soul per body. The Latin canon followed him. That is the third teaching in its complete form. The dead are held in a storehouse. The storehouse supplies the substance the sky uses for the maintenance activities that keep the world running, and the retention of each soul in the storehouse is for an appointed period, at the end of which the soul is released into a body, being prepared on the earth for its reception, for the completion of an assignment that was not completed in the previous lifetime. The mechanism is described in Jaz in chapter 41 of the Book of Parables. The chapter is preserved at Aksum. The manuscript that preserves it sits in a cedar box in the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion. And the doctrine the chapter teaches, in its specific form, was on the reading list of Christian congregations in the Eastern Mediterranean until the year 364, when the reading list was formally closed against it. There is one further passage in chapter 41 that has to be examined before the account moves on to the fourth teaching. Verse 19 describes what happens to the souls that fail, on multiple returns, to complete the assignment for which they were created. Those souls, the chapter records, are not simply cycled indefinitely. At some point, a limit is reached. The Ge'ez word for the limit is Ge'ez, a word that means the time appointed for the completion of a specific process. When the Ge'ez of a soul has been reached and the assignment has not been completed, the soul is not returned again. What happens to it instead? Chapter 41 describes in language that has generated substantial disagreement in the scholarly commentary. Isaac renders the phrase as being placed into the darkness. Nicholsburg reads the same phrase as being sealed into the fourth chamber, the chamber described in chapter 22 as containing the souls whose sin was of a lesser degree. The two readings are not exclusive. Both suggest that the soul that fails, at the terminus of its returns, is placed in a category from which no further release will occur, and that the category corresponds to one of the four chambers established in the first teaching. The system, in other words, is closed at both ends. There is a beginning point, when the soul is first created and assigned. There is an intermediate cycle, during which the soul is returned as many times as necessary for the assignment to be completed. And there is a terminus, at which the soul either graduates into the dwelling of the righteous or is sealed into the chamber from which no further release occurs. The system runs on a completion criterion, and the completion criterion is the specific reason souls are sent back down. Souls are sent back down because their assignment is not complete. The purpose of the sending is completion. When completion is reached, the sending stops. The removal of the doctrine did not end at Laodicea. What Laodicea began, the churches of the 5th and 6th centuries extended, and the extension produced the shape of the surviving Christian teaching on the afterlife that Western Christianity has transmitted continuously since. The extension is one of the most documented processes in the history of Christian dogma, and it centered on a single figure whose writings had preserved much of the Enochic material within Christian teaching after Laodicea, and whose condemnation was the mechanism by which the material was finally removed from Christian intellectual life for 1,000 years. The figure was Origen of Alexandria. Origen was born in the year 185 of the Common Era in the great Egyptian city that had preserved the Greek translation of Enoch through the 2nd and 3rd centuries, and he became the most influential Christian theologian of the first 400 years of the Church. His major systematic work, On First Principles, was completed around the year 225, and it contained a doctrine of the soul that drew directly on the Enochic material Origen had access to through the Alexandrian Greek text of the Book of Parables. Origen taught that souls pre-existed their bodies. He taught that souls were assigned to bodies according to a system that involved the previous condition of each soul in a prior stage of existence. He taught that the assignment could be reversed and that souls could pass through more than one embodiment. And he taught that the whole process was directed toward a final completion at which every soul would be restored to its original condition, a doctrine that acquired the technical name apokatastasis from the Greek word for restoration. Origen's teaching was controversial from the moment it was written down, but for the 2 centuries following his death in 253, his teaching was preserved and taught by a substantial portion of the Christian intellectual establishment, and his commentaries and his systematic work were among the most read texts in the monastic libraries of the Eastern Mediterranean. The Enochic doctrine of the storehouse and the return survived within Christian teaching primarily through Origen's transmission of it, because the Book of Parables itself had been removed from public reading at Laodicea, but the arguments that the Book of Parables contained continued to circulate in the writings of a theologian whose books were still being copied. The doctrine had a channel. The channel was Origen, and the closure of the channel was accomplished in the 6th century by the Emperor Justinian and by the council that met at Constantinople under his sponsorship in the year 553. Justinian issued a formal edict against Origen in the year 543, 10 years before the council met. The edict enumerated 9 specific doctrines Justinian identified as originating in Origen's writings and condemned each of them by name. Among the 9 were the doctrine of the pre-existence of souls, the doctrine of apokatastasis, and the doctrine that souls could be assigned to bodies according to the outcome of a prior existence. All 3 of those doctrines correspond directly to the material chapter 41 of the Book of Parables preserves in Ge'ez, in the Ethiopian tradition. The condemnation of Origen was therefore, in substance, the condemnation of the Enochic doctrine that Origen had transmitted through his writings. The council itself, The Fifth Ecumenical Council of Christian History opened in Constantinople in May of 553 and closed in June of the same year. The council issued 14 anathemas. Whether the 15 additional anathemas that were subsequently attached to the council's proceedings and that address Origen by name were actually issued by the council itself or were issued at a preparatory home synod immediately. Before the council opened is a question that has been debated by historians of the Church since the 17th century. Norman Tanner, in his edition of the Decrees of the Ecumenical Councils, published by Sheed and Ward in 1990, treats the 15 anathemas against Origen as material that was formally accepted by the council, even if the anathemas were technically issued before the council opened. The first of the 15 reads, in the standard English translation from the Greek, that anyone who asserts the fabulous pre-existence of souls and the monstrous restoration that follows from it is to be anathema. That is a formal, church-wide condemnation of the doctrine chapter 41 of the Book of Parables teaches. And it was issued at the highest level of Christian authority available in the 6th century. After 553, the doctrine could not be taught within the churches in communion with either Rome or Constantinople. Origen's writings were withdrawn from the monastic libraries where they had been preserved. The Greek text of the Book of Parables, which had circulated as a separate document within the Alexandrian tradition, disappeared from the surviving manuscript record within a generation of the council's decision. What had begun at Laodicea in 364 with the removal of the book was completed at Constantinople in 553 with the removal of the doctrine the book contained. Any further transmission of the material within Christian teaching would have to occur outside the geographic reach of the Latin and Greek churches. The only tradition where such transmission continued was the tradition of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which had been formally separated from the church at Alexandria after the Council of Chalcedon in 451, and which was, by the middle of the 6th century, no longer within either the Roman or the Constantinopolitan communion. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church, headquartered at Aksum and holding to the Miaphysite Christology that Chalcedon had condemned, continued to read Enoch aloud in its liturgy. The J.E.'s translation of the Book of Parables continued to be copied by monastic scribes in the highlands, and the doctrine of chapter 41, that the storehouse of the spirits supplies the substance the sky draws on for its maintenance, and that the release of souls into bodies being formed on the earth is directed toward the completion of assignments originally given to each soul at its creation, continued to be preached in the churches under the jurisdiction of Aksum, in a language most Christian scholars outside Ethiopia did not read. In a country most of the 5th and 6th century churchmen who condemned Origen would not have known was still preserving the material they had condemned. The isolation lasted until James Bruce brought the 3 Giez manuscripts back to Britain in 1773, and even after Bruce brought the manuscripts back, the doctrinal content of chapter 41 was not immediately recognized for what it was. Richard Lawrence, in his 1821 translation, rendered the passage in language that softened its implications, and R.H. Charles, in his 1912 translation, which became the standard English text for the next 70 years, softened them further. It was not until Ephraim Isaac's translation for the Charlesworth Old Testament pseudepigrapha edition in 1983, working directly from the Ethiopian manuscripts with the assistance of native speakers of Ge'ez and Amharic, that the specific vocabulary of the storehouse and the return was rendered in English with the concrete meaning the Ge'ez words carry. Isaac's translation is the reason a modern English reader can, for the first time in the history of the English language, read chapter 41 and see what the passage actually says. The historical trail from 364 to 1983 is one of the longest documented suppressions of a specific doctrine in the history of Western religious thought. The doctrine was on the page of a book. The book was removed from public reading by a regional council in the 4th century. The doctrine was transmitted for 2 more centuries through the writings of a single theologian. The theologian was formally condemned by an ecumenical council in the 6th century. The Greek text of the book was allowed to decay from lack of copying, so that within a century of the council's condemnation, no complete copy of the Greek text survived anywhere in the surviving Christian world. The Ge'ez text was preserved only in a country outside the reach of the councils that had made the condemnations. And the recovery of the doctrine in a form that a Western scholar could read did not happen until Bruce brought the manuscripts to Britain in the 18th century, and did not happen in a form that preserved the concrete language of the Ge'ez until Isaac's translation was published 210 years later. The reader now living has access to the material for the first time in 1,500 years. What Christian teaching held before the 4th century, what it lost between the 4th and 6th centuries, and what only Aksum preserved through the intervening period, is now available to anyone who can read English. That is the historical significance of the third teaching. Its content, that the dead power, the ongoing maintenance of the sky, and that souls are sent back down for the completion of assignments given to them at their original creation, is the specific doctrine the Christian councils of the 4th and 6th centuries most concertedly removed. Chapter 41 of the Book of Parables preserves the doctrine in its clearest form. The Ge'ez text at Aksum preserves the chapter. Ephraim Isaac's translation preserves the concrete vocabulary of the Ge'ez. And the account so far in this video has now presented the mechanism the doctrine describes and the specific reasons souls are sent back down that the doctrine gives. The remaining teachings, 4 through 7, will further develop the material this account has already presented, will show how the material is confirmed in the Egyptian and Babylonian traditions that predate Enoch by centuries, and will present the specific evidence that the mechanism the Ge'ez describes corresponds to the actual observed behavior of consciousness at the boundary between life and death in the record that modern medicine, primarily through the work of the resuscitation researchers at the University of Virginia, at Stony Brook University, and at the Southampton Study Group in the United Kingdom, has assembled over the last 40 years. Before those 4 teachings can be examined, however, the reader has a decision to make. The material this account has already presented is a substantial doctrine, and the material still to come will build on it directly. The account has to pause, and it has to pause now, so that the reader can consolidate what has been established before the next stage of the reconstruction is attempted. Before the pause, however, the account should record one further element of the third teaching that will be developed in the remaining 4 teachings, and that the reader should carry forward into what comes next. The mechanism chapter 41 describes is not, in the terms of the Ge'ez text, a metaphor. The text does not present the storehouse as a symbolic representation of a spiritual condition. The text presents the storehouse as a specific location, with specific contents, operated by a named messenger, according to specific procedures that the messenger describes to Enoch in the language of a working system. That specificity is the feature of the passage that has been most consistently missed in the standard English translations before Isaac, and that most consistently gets restored when the passage is read against the concrete meanings the Ge'ez vocabulary carries. Storehouse means storehouse. Intake means intake. Release means release. Assignment means the position given to a specific individual by a specific authority for a specific purpose. Return means return. And the passage that describes the whole system, taken together, describes something the writer of chapter 41 believed was a real structure with real contents, operating in real time, and observable through the tour Enoch was taken on for the specific purpose of recording it. The corroboration for this reading, insofar as any corroboration is possible from sources external to the Enochic corpus itself, will be examined in the 6th and 7th teachings of this account when the Egyptian and Babylonian parallels are introduced. Those parallels are extensive. They predate Enoch by centuries in some cases and by more than 1,000 years in others. They describe systems with the same structural features Enoch's chapter 41 describes. And they are preserved in sources whose textual transmission is entirely independent of the Ge'ez tradition, so that the correspondence between them and Enoch cannot be attributed to a common transmission channel. That is the argument the 6th and 7th teachings will present. Its detail can wait until the parallels are introduced. What matters, in this stage of the account, is that the reader should carry forward into the pause to the understanding that the mechanism chapter 41 describes is not a purely Jewish or purely Enochic construction. It is a version of a mechanism that ancient traditions across the entire Eastern Mediterranean and Mesopotamian world independently described in structurally similar language. A second element of the third teaching that will be developed further concerns the modern evidence for what happens at the boundary between life and death. The account has already noted that the University of Virginia Division of Perceptual Studies, under the direction of Bruce Grayson, and the AWARE studies carried out by Sam Parnia, have produced over the last 40 years a substantial body of case data on the subjective experiences reported by individuals whose consciousness had been medically demonstrated to have ceased and who were subsequently resuscitated. The case data will be examined in detail in the 5th teaching. The claim will not be that the reports prove the Enochic mechanism. The claim will be that the reports and the mechanism, produced by cultures separated by 3,000 years and by every relevant cultural feature, describe overlapping phenomena in language more similar than it should be by chance. The reader will be asked to draw the conclusion the evidence supports. The pause the account is about to take will separate what has been presented from what still remains. What has been presented is the geometry of the 4 chambers, the assignment of the righteous to the maintenance work in the dwelling, and the mechanism of the storehouse with its intake, its retention, its release, and its specific reason for the release. What still remains is a further set of details that the remaining 4 teachings will supply. The nature of the breath that is returned to a body being prepared, in chapter 61. The promise given to the spirits of the righteous, in chapter 103. The sorting of the humble for their assignments, in chapter 108, and the hidden name under which the sworn oath was established, in chapter 69. With those 4, the Egyptian and Babylonian parallels will be introduced, and the correspondence set out for the reader to judge. 4 teachings remain, and together they complete the reconstruction. Before we move on to the next teaching, stop for a second. What you just heard about the mechanism by which the dead power, the ongoing structure, and the specific reason souls are sent back down is the part that changes everything. But it only makes sense when you see it written out next to the original Aramaic fragments Milik reconstructed from Cave 4. The named chambers, the numbered return, it's all in the document linked below. Take 5 seconds right now, grab it, and then come back, because what comes next builds directly on it. The link is in the description. QR code is on your screen. The 4th teaching is drawn from chapter 61 of the Book of Parables, and it addresses the specific mechanism by which the release from the storehouse is carried out. Chapter 41 has already established that the release occurs, that the released spirits are directed into bodies being formed on the earth, and that the direction is not random but corresponds to assignments given to each spirit at its original creation. Chapter 61 specifies how the direction is accomplished. The chapter is best known in the standard commentary for a scene at its center, in which the Chosen One appears in the presence of the Lord of Spirits and pronounces judgment. That scene has attracted the majority of the scholarly attention devoted to the chapter, and it is discussed at length in Nicolsburg's Hermeneia commentary and in Vanderkam's parallel treatment. What has been less discussed, and what this account will treat as the central passage of the 4th teaching, is what happens in the verses immediately preceding the judgment scene. In those verses, messengers are sent out from the storehouse of the spirits with instruments in their hands, and the instruments are described as measuring cords. The Jez word for the instrument is a compound that Isaac renders as measuring cord, drawing on a root that carries the meaning of a line laid down for the marking of a boundary. The messengers carry the cords out of the presence of the Lord of Spirits. Their assignment, verse 2 of the chapter specifies, is to go to the earth and to measure. What they are measuring is described in verse 3. They are measuring what will be given to the righteous. The Jez phrase is ambiguous, in the same way the equivalent phrase in the astronomical passages is ambiguous. The measurement can be read as an allocation, a determination of the portion each individual will receive. It can be read as a demarcation, a marking of the location each individual will occupy. And in the context of the storehouse doctrine chapter 41 is already established, it can be read as a physical measuring of the body that is being prepared for the reception of a spirit whose retention in the storehouse is about to end. The 3 readings are not exclusive. Nicolsburg's commentary treats all 3 as active in the passage, and the Jez preserves the ambiguity. The messengers with the measuring cords go out, they measure. The measurement determines what will be given, where it will be given, and to which body it will be assigned. The chapter is describing, in the language of a working procedure, the process by which the release from the storehouse is directed to a specific target on the earth. The cord is the instrument of the direction, the messengers are the operators. And the Chosen One, whose appearance follows in the later verses of the chapter, presides over the whole process. The scene, taken together, is the 4th teaching. It shows how the mechanism of the storehouse actually operates in the moment of the release. There is one further detail in chapter 61 that will matter for the account this video is presenting. Verse 5 of the chapter records that the messengers, having completed the measurement, take the measured portion and place it into what the Gaze calls the vessels of the appointed. The vessels of the appointed is a phrase that appears only in this chapter and in one further passage in chapter 70 of the Book of Parables. Its meaning has been debated in the scholarly commentary for 2 centuries. Charles, in his 1912 translation, rendered it as containers of the elect, treating the vessel language as a metaphor for the human bodies into which the elect would be born. Isaac, in his 1983 translation, preserved the concrete Jez wording, treating the vessel as a physical container into which the measured spirit is placed prior to its transportation to the body being prepared. Nicolsburg's commentary is neutral on the reading, but notes that the Jez usage is closer to Isaac's than to Charles's. The vessel, on Isaac's reading, is an intermediate holding structure. The spirit is measured. The measured spirit is placed in the vessel. The vessel is carried by the messenger from the storehouse to the earth. The vessel is opened at the moment of the arrival of the spirit in the body, and the moment of the arrival is the moment at which the body first becomes animate. This reading of chapter 61, if it is the correct one, provides the specific mechanism by which the storehouse release is completed. The spirit is measured. The measured portion is placed in a vessel. The vessel is carried by a messenger. The vessel is opened at the moment of embodiment. The body becomes animate, and the spirit, now embodied, begins the second stage of the assignment for which it was originally created and whose completion the storehouse retention was designed to permit. That, in the language of chapter 61, is the return of the breath. The breath is the animating substance. The measurement determines the portion. The vessel is the intermediate container. The messenger is the operator, and the body is the destination. The Egyptian material this account will examine in the fifth teaching contains a structurally similar description of the return. The papyrus of Ani, in the scenes that surround the weighing of the heart, describes the ba of the deceased as being placed into a container for the transportation between the world of the dead and the world of the living. The container is portrayed in the vignettes with a specific shape, a shape that Egyptologists have identified as a stylized rendering of a birthing basin. That specific detail, and its correspondence to the vessel of the appointed in chapter 61, will be developed at length in the fifth teaching. What matters at this stage is that the Enochic description of the return mechanism has structural features that correspond to features preserved in the Egyptian material, and the correspondence is not superficial. The correspondence is specific to the mechanism of the return. Chapter 61 contains one further passage that has to be noted before the fourth teaching can be summarized. Verses 8 through 13 of the chapter, the judgment scene proper, describe the chosen one as the entity to whom the accounting of each returned spirit is made. When a spirit's assignment is complete and the spirit has finally been moved from the earth into the dwelling of the righteous, the chosen one is the entity who reviews the completion. The review is described in the Geas as an accounting of what was assigned, what was accomplished, and what remains. If the accounting shows that the assignment has been completed, the spirit is admitted to the dwelling and integrated into the maintenance work that chapter 39 describes. If the accounting shows that the assignment has not been completed, the spirit is returned to the storehouse for another cycle. The chosen one is the entity who administers the criterion. The criterion is the completion of the original assignment, and the administration of the criterion is what the judgment scene in this reading is describing. The reading of the judgment scene in chapter 61 as an accounting of assignment completion is not the standard reading in the commentary tradition. The standard reading treats the judgment scene as a general eschatological pronouncement about the outcome of the final day. The Ge'ez text supports either reading. The internal evidence of the Book of Parables, taken as a whole, supports the reading this account is presenting, because the material in chapters 41, 61, and 108, taken together, describes a system in which each spirit has an original assignment, a period of storehouse retention between embodiments, one or more returns to complete the assignment, and a final review at the point of completion or of terminal failure. Chapter 61 is the chapter in which the review is described in the greatest procedural detail. The chosen one is the reviewer. The measuring cords are the instruments by which the assignment is initially specified. The vessels of the appointed are the intermediate containers, and the return of the breath into the body being prepared is the operational culmination of the whole procedure. The fourth teaching, in summary, is this. The release from the storehouse is directed by messengers who carry measuring cords out of the presence of the Lord of Spirits. The messengers measure what will be given to each returning spirit. The measured portion is placed in a vessel. The vessel is transported to the earth, and the vessel is opened at the moment of embodiment. The chosen one, upon the eventual completion of each spirit's original assignment, reviews the completion and admits the spirit into the dwelling of the righteous, where the maintenance work is carried out. The mechanism of the return is preserved in Ge'ez, in chapter 61 of the Book of Parables. The mechanism corresponds, in its structural features, to material preserved in the Egyptian papyri that will be examined in the fifth teaching. And the mechanism, in its Ge'ez form at Aksum, has been in continuous liturgical use in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church for approximately 15 centuries. In a body of scripture no other Christian communion has preserved. The passage this account has just presented is the completion of the third teaching's account of the mechanism. Chapters 41 and 61, taken together, describe the whole cycle from intake to release. The remaining teachings will develop specific aspects of the cycle that these two chapters have not fully addressed. The fifth teaching will address the specific promise made to the spirits of the righteous who died in sorrow, that is, whose assignments were interrupted by circumstances of suffering they did not deserve. The sixth teaching will address the specific criteria by which the humble spirits are sorted for their assignments on the return. The seventh teaching will address the regulatory guarantee under which the whole process operates, the hidden name, and the sworn oath in chapter 69. And the parallel material from Egypt and Babylon will be introduced to show that the mechanism the Enochic corpus describes was not unique to the Jewish tradition of the Second Temple period, but was a widely attested feature of the ancient understanding of the movement of souls between the world of the living and the world of the dead. The fifth teaching is drawn from chapter 103 of the Epistle of Enoch, and it addresses a specific category of returning spirits that the first four teachings have only touched on. The category is the spirits of the righteous, whose lives ended in sorrow, in circumstances they did not deserve, in suffering that interrupted their assignments through no fault of their own. Chapter 103 is one of the few chapters of the Book of Parables and the Epistle whose contents are also confirmed by an Aramaic fragment from Cave 4 at Qumran. The fragment is 4Q 204, and it preserves portions of chapters 103 and 104 of the Ethiopian text. Where the Aramaic and the Ge'ez overlap, the two texts agree. The promise made in chapter 103 is one of the doctrines of the Enochic corpus that can be traced to a Jewish source predating the turn of the Common Era. The chapter opens with Enoch addressing a specific audience directly. He addresses the righteous who have died in sorrow, and he addresses them as a class of the dead whose particular condition requires a particular promise. The Ge'ez word for the sorrow is a compound that Isaac renders in the Standard English as grief, and that other translators have rendered as mourning or as affliction. The concrete meaning of the Ge'ez is the condition of one whose life was ended before its natural time by circumstances of injustice, violence, or persecution. These are, in the framework the earlier teachings have established, the souls whose assignments were interrupted. They died before the assignment could be completed. And the promise chapter 103 makes to them is specific to their condition. The promise is preserved in verses 3 through 8 of the chapter. It runs as follows in Isaac's translation. The righteous who have died in sorrow are told that their spirits will be made to rejoice, that their memory will not perish before the entity Enoch calls the Lord of Spirits, that they will not be forgotten in the day when their assignment is resumed, and that the completion of the assignment will not be delayed on account of what was done to them in the interruption. The promise is specific. It is not a general assurance of blessedness. It is a commitment that the assignment will be resumed, that the interruption will not be counted against the spirit, and that the delay will not extend the period of storehouse retention beyond what would have been required if the interruption had not occurred. This is the fifth teaching in its narrowest form. The souls of the righteous whose deaths were the result of injustice, violence, or persecution are not disadvantaged in the storehouse system by the fact of the interruption. Their assignments are preserved. Their next return will resume the assignment from the point at which the interruption occurred. And the storehouse operators, in the language of chapter 103, are specifically instructed to give the resumed assignment priority in the queue of releases. The souls of those who died in sorrow are not made to wait longer. They are, on the internal evidence of chapters 41, 61, and 103 read together, moved to the front of the queue. The doctrine has an obvious and specific application in the context in which the Book of Parables was composed. The last decades before the Common Era and the first decades after it were, in Judea and in the diaspora, a period of intense political and religious persecution. Communities loyal to the Second Temple tradition were being killed in significant numbers by the successive imperial powers that controlled the region and by the local factional violence that the imperial presence produced. The composition of the Book of Parables in the shadow of that persecution produced a doctrine designed to comfort the surviving families of the killed. The killed have not been forgotten. Their assignments are preserved. Their next return will resume the work that the persecution interrupted. And the storehouse system, in the framework the Book of Parables presents, is specifically designed to accommodate the category of the persecuted righteous as a distinct case with priority handling. Nicolsburg's Hermeneia commentary on chapter 103 is one of the more theologically pointed portions of his treatment of the Enochic corpus. He notes that the doctrine of chapter 103, while it is a doctrine of comfort and of promise, is not the doctrine of a general resurrection in the sense that the later Christian tradition would develop it. The chapter does not promise the righteous a body raised from the tomb. The chapter promises the righteous a return to a new body, prepared on the earth for the reception of the resumed spirit, and the resumption of an assignment whose completion the interruption did not cancel. That is a different doctrine from the doctrine of general resurrection. It is the doctrine of storehouse release with priority handling for the interrupted assignments of the persecuted righteous. The distinction between the two doctrines is not a scholastic point. It is one of the specific reasons the Latin canon eventually declined to preserve chapter 103. The Latin canon, as it developed through the 4th and 5th centuries, held to a doctrine of general resurrection in which each individual, at the end of the age, would be raised in the body that had been buried and would be presented before God for judgment. The doctrine of chapter 103 is incompatible with the general resurrection doctrine, because the return chapter 103 describes is a return to a new body, not to the buried body, and the resumption chapter 103 describes is a resumption of the interrupted assignment on the earth, not a presentation before God at the end of the age. The two doctrines produce different expectations, different consolations, and different pastoral advice to the surviving families of the persecuted. The Latin canon preserved the general resurrection doctrine. The Enochic corpus preserved a different doctrine, and the Enochic doctrine was removed. The Aramaic fragment 4Q204 preserves a portion of chapter 103 in the language of its original composition, and the portion preserved includes verses 3 through 6, the core of the promise. The Aramaic text confirms the Jez wording at the points where the two overlap. Millick's 1976 edition of the fragment provides the paleographic dating of the manuscript to somewhere in the first half of the 1st century of the Common Era, which places the fragment within a generation on either side of the composition of the New Testament. The doctrine chapter 103 teaches was, in other words, actively taught in Jewish circles at the same time and in the same region where the New Testament was being composed. The two doctrines coexisted in the same historical moment. The Latin canon eventually preserved one of them and eliminated the other. The Ethiopian tradition preserved both. There is one further passage in chapter 103 that will matter for the account this video is presenting. Verse 12 of the chapter describes what happens to the memory of the righteous who died in sorrow during the period of their storehouse retention. The Gez word for memory is tazkar, which carries the specific meaning of the retained record of a specific individual by a specific authority, closer in usage to what an English speaker would call a file or a dossier than to what an English speaker would call a general remembrance. The tazkar of each righteous soul who died in sorrow, verse 12 records, is kept before the throne of the Lord of Spirits during the period of storehouse retention. The keeping is specifically described. The tazkar is not put away in a general archive. It is kept in the presence of the entity at the throne, so that when the moment of release arrives, the tazkar can be consulted and the assignment can be resumed from the exact point of interruption. The record of the interrupted assignment is preserved with the individual specificity of a working file, and the resumption is not a general return to a general condition of embodiment. It is a resumption of the specific work that the specific individual was doing when the specific interruption occurred. That is the 5th teaching in its complete form. The righteous who died in sorrow are given a specific promise. Their spirits will be made to rejoice, their memory will be preserved as an active record before the throne, their assignments will be resumed at the exact point of interruption in a new body prepared for the reception, and their period of storehouse retention will be short because they are given priority handling in the release queue. The doctrine is preserved in the Ge'ez text of the Aksum manuscripts. It is confirmed in the Aramaic fragment 4Q204. It differs from the doctrine of general resurrection that the Latin canon eventually preserved. And it is one of the pieces of the Enochic doctrine of the dead that the Council of Laodicea and the subsequent condemnations of Origen at Constantinople in 553 together removed from the canonical teaching of the Christian tradition west of the Ethiopian highlands. Before the 6th teaching is introduced, one further correspondence should be noted, because it will matter when the Egyptian parallel material is examined. The Egyptian Book of Coming Forth by Day contains, in the papyri produced during the New Kingdom period, a specific formula addressed to the deceased whose life was ended in circumstances of injustice. The formula is preserved most fully in the Papyrus of Nu, catalogued as British Museum Papyrus number 10477, and it promises the deceased that the record of the interruption will be presented before the tribunal at the moment of the weighing of the heart, that the interruption will not be counted against the deceased in the determination of the outcome, and that the specific assignment on which the deceased was working will be resumed after the weighing has been completed. The correspondence between the promise in chapter 103 of Enoch and the formula in the Papyrus of Nu is not a general one. It is a specific one, and the specificity of the correspondence will be developed at length in the fifth teaching when the Egyptian material is introduced. What matters at this stage is that the doctrine of the interrupted assignment and the priority resumption is not unique to the Enochic corpus. It is preserved in structurally similar language, in a source from a different tradition, in a different language, transmitted through a different textual channel. The correspondence is one of the pieces of evidence this account will present for the claim that the Enochic mechanism was not a purely Jewish invention, but a version of a mechanism the ancient traditions of the Eastern Mediterranean widely attest. The sixth teaching is drawn from chapter 108, the final chapter of the entire Ethiopian compilation of Enoch, and it addresses the specific criteria by which the spirits held in the storehouse are sorted for their assignments on the return. Chapter 108 has an unusual position in the structure of the Book of Enoch. It appears in the manuscript as a separate composition attached to the end of the epistle, and its opening verse identifies it as another book that Enoch wrote for his son Methuselah, containing material that had not been recorded in the earlier sections. That designation, another book, is preserved in the Aramaic fragment 4Q204, which also preserves portions of the first verses of the chapter. The chapter is therefore ancient. Its content is confirmed at Qumran, and its content is treated in the internal structure of the compilation as a distinct final teaching that stands somewhat apart from the material that precedes it. The chapter opens with Enoch describing what he was shown of the sorting. The Ge'ez word for the sorting is a verb Isaac renders as separating, and that carries the concrete meaning of distinguishing one category from another according to a specified criterion. The sorting Enoch describes in chapter 108 is a sorting of the spirits held in the storehouse into two categories, and the specification of the criterion by which the two categories are distinguished is the sixth teaching in its narrowest form. The criterion is not what the reader raised in the Latin framework would expect. The criterion is not the general moral quality of the previous life. The criterion is more specific. The Ge'ez text of chapter 108 verses 7 through 11, in Isaac's translation, specifies that the spirits are sorted according to whether they have been humble in the specific sense of having mortified the flesh during their previous embodiment. The word Isaac renders as mortified is a Ge'ez compound whose root sense is to have restrained or to have subordinated. The spirits who have subordinated the desires of their flesh to the requirements of their assignment are placed in one category. The spirits who have not are placed in another. The distinction is not a moral one in the general sense. It is a specific one, and the specificity has to do with the individual's cooperation with the original assignment during the previous lifetime. Those who cooperated by subordinating other desires to the requirements of the assignment are given priority handling in the release queue. Those who did not are held longer in the storehouse and are given assignments on the next return that are more constrained, presumably to compensate for the tendency of the flesh to interfere with the completion of the assignment when the flesh has not been trained to subordinate. That is a specific doctrine of the assignment relationship, and it corresponds to a specific claim about what happens during the previous embodiment. The claim is that the desires of the flesh are not automatically aligned with the requirements of the assignment. The requirements of the assignment are given by the entity Enoch calls the Lord of Spirits. The desires of the flesh arise from the specific material configuration of the body being inhabited by the spirit. The two sets of requirements do not automatically coincide. The spirit that recognizes the requirements of the assignment and that trains the body to subordinate its own desires to those requirements will complete more of the assignment in a given lifetime than the spirit that does not. And the completion rate, over successive lifetimes, is the specific criterion by which chapter 108 sorts the spirits held in the storehouse for the release queue. Verses 12 through 15 of the chapter continue the description. The spirits who have been sorted into the priority category are described in the Ge'ez as those who have loved God, which in the specific context of the chapter means those who have oriented their lives during the previous embodiment toward the requirements of the assignment given by the Lord of Spirits. These spirits, verse 12 records, will be brought forth into a bright light. The Ge'ez word for the bright light is Burhan, the same word used in chapter 22 for the bright spring in the first chamber of the four hollow places. The correspondence is not accidental. The spirits who have been sorted into the priority category, on the internal evidence of the Ethiopian text read as a whole, are the spirits who are moved to the first chamber for their storehouse retention. The first chamber's bright spring is where they are held. And the release from the first chamber, when it comes, is a release into a body prepared for the reception of a spirit whose previous cooperation with the assignment has qualified it for a further stage. The correspondence between the language of chapter 22 and the language of chapter 108 is one of the internal features that argues for the unity of the whole Enochic doctrine of the dead. Chapter 22 established the four chambers. Chapter 108 specifies which category of spirit is moved to which chamber, and it does so by naming the same working light source. The bright spring in chapter 22 is the bright light in chapter 108. The souls of the righteous in chapter 22 are the spirits who have loved God in the specific sense of chapter 108. The witnessing activity, described in chapter 22 verse 11, is the participation in the maintenance activities described in chapter 39. And the sorting criterion in chapter 108, the subordination of the flesh's desires to the requirements of the assignment, is the mechanism by which the initial assignment to the first chamber is determined. The GES text of chapter 108 contains one further passage that will matter for the account this video is presenting. Verses 15 through 18 describe what happens to the spirits who are sorted into the priority category after their release from the storehouse. They are given, on the return, specific assignments that verse 16 enumerates in general categories. Some are given assignments involving the maintenance of the boundaries between categories on the earth, corresponding to the sixth of the maintenance activities described in chapter 39 as the messenger's work. Others are given assignments involving the transmission of specific teachings to specific individuals on the earth, corresponding to the intercessory activity described in chapter 39 verse 4. A third group is given assignments involving what the GES calls the preservation of specific individuals, meaning the protection of particular persons who are themselves working on assignments that have not yet been completed. The categories overlap. Not all returning spirits receive assignments in all three categories, but the categories together describe the range of assignments the returning spirits on the priority track are given. That is a specific and remarkable claim. Chapter 108 is saying that the spirits who return from the storehouse on the priority track are working in their new lifetimes on assignments that involve the maintenance of the world, the transmission of teachings, and the protection of other individuals. They are not simply living out their own lives for their own sakes. They are on assignment. The assignments are given by the entity at the throne of the storehouse, and the assignments are chosen to correspond to the requirements of the ongoing maintenance activities described in chapter 39. This is the doctrine that most directly implicates the modern reader in what the Enochic corpus is describing. If chapter 108 is telling the truth, then some portion of the individuals currently alive on the earth are spirits that have returned from the storehouse on the priority track, that are working on assignments given at the throne, and that are engaged in tasks whose completion contributes to the maintenance of the world in ways they may not fully recognize themselves. The account chapter 108 gives does not identify these individuals to their neighbors, and it does not identify them to themselves in any explicit way, but the account does specify that they exist. The GES text is clear on the point. The Council of Laodicea's removal of the material was not the removal of an abstract theological speculation. It was the removal of a claim about the concrete composition of the population of the living. A portion of the population, according to chapter 108, has returned from the storehouse on assignment. The sixth teaching, in summary, is this. The spirits held in the storehouse are sorted for the release queue according to a specific criterion, the criterion being their cooperation during the previous embodiment with the requirements of the assignment for which they were originally created. The cooperation is described in the GES as the subordination of the desires of the flesh to the requirements of the assignment. The spirits who have cooperated are moved to the first chamber for their storehouse retention, are held near the bright spring described in chapter 22, and are released on the priority track with assignments in the specific categories chapter 108 enumerates. The categories include the maintenance of the boundaries, the transmission of specific teachings, and the protection of specific individuals. And the returning spirits on the priority track are, in the language of chapter 108, a portion of the population of the living. The doctrine is preserved in the GES text of the Aksum manuscripts. The chapter is confirmed at its opening by the Aramaic fragment 4Q 204, and the doctrine is one of the specific reasons the Latin canon eventually declined to preserve the Enochic corpus. The doctrine describes a category of the living that the Latin canon's framework does not include and cannot accommodate. The seventh teaching is drawn from chapter 69 of the Book of Parables, and it addresses the regulatory guarantee under which the whole storehouse and return system operates. The first six teachings have described the mechanism, the reason, and the specific procedures by which the mechanism runs. The seventh teaching describes what holds the mechanism in place, what prevents its interruption by external forces. What ensures that the operators cannot be prevented from carrying out their assigned functions, and that the system cannot be diverted by any of the various entities that would divert it if they could? The chapter identifies a specific structure that provides the guarantee. The structure is described as a sworn oath. The oath is entrusted to a specific messenger, and it is upheld by a specific hidden name that only the entrusted messenger is permitted to speak. Chapter 69 opens with a passage that has puzzled Enoch commentators since Charles's 1912 translation. The passage lists a set of names, and the names are the names of the fallen watchers who descended to Mount Hermon in the first section of the Book of the Watchers. Each name is given, and each is paired with a specific teaching the named watcher gave to the humans he corrupted. The list is longer than the corresponding list in Chapter 8, and the pairings are more specific. The list continues through the first 13 verses of the chapter. It is only at verse 14 that the chapter turns to the subject of the sworn oath. That transition, from the list of the corrupt to the description of the guarantee, is not accidental. The chapter is presenting the guarantee as the mechanism that prevents the corruption transmitted by the Watchers from spreading to the operational structure of the storehouse. The corruption occurred. The Watchers taught what they taught. Humans were changed by the teaching. But the storehouse operators and the maintenance of the world they carry out were not affected, because the guarantee that had been established at the beginning prevented the corruption from reaching them. Verses 14 through 17 of the chapter introduce the entity through whom the corruption attempted to reach the storehouse. The entity is named. His name in the Ge'ez is Casbiel, and he is identified as the chief of the oath, the entity who had knowledge of the mechanism by which the oath had been established and who therefore had the potential, if he could learn the hidden name that upheld the oath, to interfere with the working of the whole system. Casbiel, according to the chapter, sought to learn the hidden name. His seeking failed, and the description of why it failed, and of what prevented Casbiel from learning the name, is the seventh teaching. The hidden name is described in verses 15 through 25 of chapter 69, and the description is more detailed than any comparable passage in the surviving Second Temple literature. The name is entrusted to Michael, one of the 4 archangels who serve at the throne of the Lord of Spirits. Michael holds the name. He is permitted to speak it in the specific circumstances that the chapter enumerates. He is not permitted to speak it in any other circumstances, and no other entity, according to the Ge'ez text, is permitted to speak it at all. The name is described as the specific verbal formula by which the sworn oath is upheld, and the sworn oath is described as the specific verbal act by which the entire operational structure of the created world was established at the beginning. Verses 18 through 23 of the chapter enumerate what the sworn oath holds in place. The list is long. The oath holds the sea within its boundaries, so that the sea does not overflow the land. The oath holds the sun and the moon in their courses, so that the days and the months proceed in their appointed order. The oath holds the stars in their paths, so that the constellations appear at their appointed times. The oath holds the winds in the storehouses, so that the winds are released in correct proportion by the operators. The oath holds the rains in the reservoirs above, so that the rains fall in correct measure. The oath holds the storehouses of the spirits in their operational state, so that the intake, the retention, and the release proceed according to the procedures the earlier chapters have described. Everything that has to be maintained for the world to continue running is enumerated in the list. The oath is the guarantee for all of it. The correspondence between the list in Chapter 69 and the list of maintenance activities in Chapter 39 is not accidental. Chapter 39 describes the 6 activities the messengers carry out at any given moment. Chapter 69 describes the guarantee under which those 6 activities are performed. The messengers perform the maintenance because the oath, upheld by the hidden name entrusted to Michael, ensures that the maintenance cannot be interrupted from outside. The 2 chapters are addressing the same operational structure from 2 different directions. Chapter 39 describes the work. Chapter 69 describes the guarantee that permits the work to continue. That guarantee is the 7th teaching in its narrowest form. The whole system of the storehouse and the return, the whole system of the maintenance of the world, the whole system Enoch has been shown across the tour that produced the surviving book, is held in place by a sworn oath. The oath was established at the beginning by the entity Enoch calls the Lord of Spirits. The oath is upheld by a specific hidden name. The name is entrusted to a specific messenger, Michael, who is permitted to speak it under specific circumstances and no other. And the entities that would interfere with the system, of whom Casbiel is the archetype, cannot interfere because they cannot learn the name that upholds the oath. The theological significance of this teaching in the framework the Book of Parables presents is that the system is not fragile. The Enochic corpus does not describe a system that runs by continuous divine improvisation and that could fail at any moment if the divine attention were to be distracted. The Enochic corpus describes a system that runs by the operation of a fixed guarantee, established at the beginning under a sworn oath, protected by a hidden name, and continuously enforced by the messenger to whom the name is entrusted. The system is stable, its stability is engineered, and the engineering is described, in chapter 69, in the specific language of a working legal instrument with a party, a subject matter, an operative formula, and a designated enforcement authority. This is not the language of poetic religious expression in the general sense. This is the language of what a legal historian would recognize as a working contract of the ancient Near Eastern type. The specific parallels to the treaty documents of the late Bronze Age, Hittite, and Egyptian traditions have been noted by scholars working on the ancient Near Eastern background of the Enochic corpus. The oath in chapter 69 has the structural features of an ancient treaty, its formal identification of the parties, its specification of the operative subject matter, its designation of a specific enforcement authority, and its inclusion of a hidden name whose function is analogous to the seal on a treaty document, are all features that appear in the surviving diplomatic correspondence of the second millennium before the Common Era. The chapter is not inventing a religious metaphor. The chapter is describing a working structure that would have been immediately recognizable to any reader of the Second Temple period who was familiar with the treaty and covenant literature of the ancient Near East. The reader would have recognized what the chapter was describing, and the reader would have recognized the seriousness with which the chapter was treating the subject. The last verses of chapter 69, verses 24 through 29, describe the outcome of Casbiel's attempt to learn the hidden name. The outcome is that Casbiel failed, the name was not disclosed, the guarantee held, and the system, according to the chapter, has continued to run since the moment of the failure without interruption from the entities that would interrupt it. The storehouse operators continue to receive spirits at intake, hold them for the appointed periods, release them into bodies being prepared, and administer the completion criterion. The messengers continue to carry the measuring cords and the vessels of the appointed. The Chosen One continues to preside over the accounting of completed assignments, and Michael continues to hold the hidden name. The seventh teaching, in summary, is this. The whole system Enoch has been shown is held in place by a sworn oath. The oath was established at the beginning under the authority of the Lord of Spirits. The oath is upheld by a hidden name entrusted to the messenger, Michael. The entities that would interfere with the operation of the system cannot interfere because they cannot learn the name. The system is therefore stable. Its stability is engineered, and the engineering is described in the specific language of an ancient legal instrument. The doctrine is preserved in the Ge'ez text of the Aksum manuscripts. The corresponding Aramaic material has not been recovered from Cave 4 because the Book of Parables is not represented in the Cave 4 fragments. But the internal evidence of the Ge'ez text and the parallels to the ancient Near Eastern treaty literature that surrounded the composition of the Enochic corpus together support the reading this account has presented. The seven teachings, taken together, describe a working system, stable, engineered, with intake, retention, release, direction, criterion, sorting, and regulatory guarantee. What the first teaching mapped the geometry of, the seventh teaching now closes with the guarantee that holds the whole in place. The remaining sections of this account will introduce the parallel material from Egypt and from Babylonia that corresponds, in structurally similar language, to the seven teachings this account has just presented. The Egyptian material will be examined first because the Egyptian sources are the older ones, and because the Egyptian correspondence has the most extensive documentary base. The Babylonian material will follow, and the account will close with a return to the manuscript in the cedar box in the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion in Aksum, where the doctrine this account has reconstructed has been preserved in continuous liturgical use since the middle of the 4th century of the Common Era. In a body of scripture no other Christian tradition has kept intact. The Egyptian parallel material is older than the Enochic corpus by more than 1,000 years in some of its sources, and it survives in a documentary base that no other ancient tradition can match. The Book of Coming Forth by Day, which the modern English scholarship has for over a century called the Book of the Dead, is not a single composition, but a collection of spells, formulas, and instructional passages that were adapted, added to, and reorganized across the entire period from the New Kingdom in the 16th century before the Common Era through the Ptolemaic period in the last centuries before the Common Era. The oldest antecedents of the collection, in the pyramid texts inscribed on the walls of the Pyramid of Unas at Saqqara in the 24th century before the Common Era, predate the composition of the Book of the Watchers by more than 2,000 years. The middle antecedents, in the coffin texts of the Middle Kingdom, predate it by more than 1,500. And the papyri that preserve the full Book of Coming Forth by Day in its most developed form, the Papyrus of Ani, produced during the reign of Seti I or Ramesses II in the 13th century before the Common Era, predate it by approximately 1,000 years. The Egyptian material describes a system that has the same operational structure as the system Enoch describes. There is a storehouse. The storehouse holds the vital essence that leaves the body at death. The essence is called, in the Egyptian, the Ka. The Ka has to be maintained by offerings from the living. The maintenance of the Ka permits the Ka to participate in the operational structure of the world of the gods. And, in a set of passages preserved primarily in the coffin texts and adapted into the later Book of Coming Forth by Day, the Ka can be released from the storehouse to return to a new body prepared for its reception on the earth. That last claim is the one that has been most consistently missed in the popular scholarship on the Egyptian afterlife. And it is the specific claim that this account will develop because the correspondence between it and the Enochic doctrine of storehouse release is the most striking of the parallels between the two traditions. The Egyptian conception of the afterlife distinguished among several components of what the modern reader would call a single soul. The Ka was the vital essence, the animating principle that departed the body at death. The Ba was the personality, the individuated identity, portrayed in the vignettes of the New Kingdom papyri as a bird with a human head. The Akh was the transfigured spirit, the condition to which a properly prepared deceased could be elevated in the world of the dead. The distinction among these three, discussed in detail in Rundle Clark's Myth and Symbol in Ancient Egypt and more recently in John Assman's Death and Salvation in Ancient Egypt, is not a simple tripartite division of the soul. It is a specification of the different roles played by different components of the working substance of the human being before and after death, in the operational structure of the world. The Ka has the closest correspondence to the Jiez Nafas of chapter 41 of Enoch. Both are described as the animating principle that leaves the body at death, and each returns to a specific location for retention after death. In each tradition, the substance is available for release under specific circumstances into a body being prepared. And in each, that same substance is described as what the working of the operational structure of the world draws on for its supply. The correspondence is not one that has been made by later scholars imposing an interpretive framework on either tradition. The correspondence is preserved in the specific vocabulary the two traditions use, and the vocabulary in each tradition was fixed centuries before the two traditions could have influenced each other in any direct way. The weighing of the heart scene, which appears in the Papyrus of Ani in the vignette that accompanies the 125th chapter of the Book of Coming Forth by Day, is the scene the popular scholarship has treated as the primary Egyptian representation of the judgment of the dead. The scene shows the deceased, led by Anubis into the Hall of the Two Truths. The heart of the deceased is placed on a scale. The counterweight is the feather of Ma'at, the goddess of the ordered structure of the world. Thoth records the result. Osiris presides. If the heart is lighter than the feather, the deceased is admitted to the field of reeds, the working environment in which the properly prepared spirits participate in the maintenance of the world. If the heart is heavier than the feather, the deceased is delivered to Ammit, the composite creature portrayed with the head of a crocodile, the fore of a lion, and the hind of a hippopotamus, who devours the heart and thereby destroys the specific individual identity of the deceased. This is the standard reading of the scene. The standard reading is incomplete. The vignettes of the Papyrus of Ani and of the Papyrus of Hunefer both contain a specific detail that the standard reading tends to omit. In the register beneath the weighing scene in each papyrus, or in the panel immediately adjacent to it, the Ba of the deceased is portrayed being received into a container held by an attendant figure. The container has a specific shape, discussed in Assman's treatment of the mortuary papyri, that Egyptologists have identified as a stylized rendering of a birthing basin, the specific type of ceramic vessel used by Egyptian midwives during the New Kingdom in the delivery of infants. The correspondence between the shape of the vessel in the mortuary papyri and the shape of the birthing basin from the ordinary domestic archaeology of the same period is precise. It is not a stylistic accident. The vessel in the mortuary papyri is portrayed with the specific features of a birthing basin, and the Ba of the deceased is portrayed being received into it in the specific circumstances of the moment following the weighing of the heart, The reading this account offers of that iconographic detail is the reading that the correspondence with chapter 61 of Enoch supports. The vessel is the vessel of the appointed. The ba is the measured portion. The attendant figure holding the vessel is the operator, the Egyptian equivalent of the messenger in chapter 61, who carries the vessel from the storehouse to the earth. And the moment of the weighing of the heart, in this reading, is the moment at which the accounting of the previous embodiment is carried out, the assignment completion or non-completion is determined, and the disposition of the ba is decided. If the heart is lighter than the feather, the assignment was completed and the ba is elevated to the ak condition and admitted to the working environment of the field of reeds. If the heart is heavier than the feather, but not so heavy as to warrant devourment by Amit, the ba is placed in the vessel of the appointed, carried to the earth, and released into a body being prepared for its reception, for another attempt at the assignment. Only in the case of the specific class of the deceased, whose hearts are so heavy as to warrant devourment, is the specific individual identity destroyed. The rest continue in the cycle. That reading is not the standard reading, but that reading is consistent with the specific iconographic detail of the vessel in the mortuary papyri, and it is consistent with the specific correspondence between the Egyptian and Enochic language for the release mechanism. Osman's treatment of the mortuary literature, while it does not commit to this reading in the specific form this account has presented, notes the ambiguity of the disposition of the ba in the vignettes, and notes that the standard reading, in which the ba is simply admitted to the world of the dead as an ach, does not fully account for the iconographic details of the vessel and the attendant figure. The reading this account presents accounts for those details. Whether it is the reading the Egyptian tradition itself would have endorsed is a question the surviving documentation does not fully settle. But the reading is available in the material, and the correspondence with the Enochic doctrine is what makes it worth taking seriously. The coffin texts of the Middle Kingdom contain a spell that is one of the most striking parallels to chapter 41 of the Book of Parables. The spell is coffin text 335, adapted in the later Book of Coming Forth by Day as spell 17, and it describes the deceased being received into what the text calls the Great House, a specific location in the world of the dead where the deceased is held for a period between embodiments. The Great House is described in language that treats it as a storehouse. It has a specific keeper, its contents are enumerated. The deceased is placed among the contents, and the release from the Great House, when it comes, is described in the specific language of a return to the world of the living for the resumption of specific tasks. The correspondence between the Great House of Coffin, text 335, and the storehouse of the spirits of chapter 41 of Enoch is not superficial. The two structures perform the same function, are operated by the same category of intermediary figures, and produce the same outcome. The Egyptian material is older by more than 1,000 years. The correspondence is not the result of Egyptian dependence on the Enochic corpus. If any dependence exists, it runs the other way, and the parallel Asman's treatment of coffin text 335 draws with later Jewish and early Christian material acknowledges the possibility explicitly. The Egyptian conception of the sun god Ra provides one further parallel that has to be examined before this teaching can be summarized. Ra is described in the pyramid texts and in the later Book of Gates as traveling through the underworld each night in a boat, passing through 12 hours corresponding to the 12 hours of the night, and being received in the morning by the goddess Nut, who swallows him at the western horizon and gives birth to him at the eastern horizon at dawn. The daily cycle of the sun is portrayed as a cycle of death and rebirth. The sun dies at sunset. The sun is retained in the world of the dead through the 12 hours of the night. The sun is reborn at sunrise. The cycle is continuous, structured, and precisely timed. And the specific mechanism by which the cycle is accomplished, in the pyramid texts and in the coffin texts, is a mechanism in which the vital essence of the sun is received into the storehouse of the world of the dead at sunset, is retained for the duration of the night, and is released at dawn into the body of the sun being prepared for the reception. The daily cycle of the sun is, in the Egyptian conception, a scaled-down version of the general cycle of the vital essence between the storehouse and the body. What happens to the sun each day is what happens to each individual soul over the longer period of the storehouse retention. The Egyptian material treats the two cycles as the same cycle running at different frequencies, and that treatment corresponds, in its structural features, to the Enochic doctrine of the same operational structure running the maintenance of the world and the return of the souls, described in chapters 39, 41, and 61 of the Book of Parables. The Egyptian sources are older. The Egyptian sources are more extensive. The Egyptian sources are preserved in a documentary base that includes carved inscriptions on royal tombs, papyri deposited in private burials, and painted vignettes on coffin walls, dating from a range of periods spanning nearly 3,000 years. The correspondence between the Egyptian and Enochic material is not the result of one tradition copying the other. The correspondence is the result of both traditions describing the same operational structure in the language and iconography available to each. That the Enochic corpus was composed by Jewish writers in the last centuries before the Common Era, and that the Egyptian material was composed by Egyptian priests in the 2nd and 3rd millennia before the Common Era does not diminish. The correspondence. The correspondence is what it is, and its existence is the primary evidence this account will present for the claim that the mechanism the 7 teachings describe is not a purely Jewish invention. Whether the two traditions were describing a common source in the ancient Near Eastern religious environment, whether they were independently arriving at similar accounts of the operational structure through the same kind of religious speculation, or whether they were describing a real feature of the way the world works that both traditions had access to through the specific religious techniques they each practiced, is a question the surviving material cannot fully settle. What the surviving material can settle is that the correspondence exists, that it is specific to the mechanism of the storehouse and the release, that it is not the result of textual dependence in either direction, and that the Egyptian material predates the Enochic material by a substantial margin. The reader, who takes the 7 teachings seriously, as an account of the operational structure of the world of the dead, has to take the Egyptian correspondence into consideration in reaching a judgment about what the account is, describing. The Babylonian and Sumerian material addresses the same structure from a third direction. The Sumerian texts that predate the Enochic corpus by more than 2,000 years describe an underworld with named administrators, specific procedures for the reception of the dead, a system of maintenance offerings that the living are required to provide, and, in a set of texts that Thorkild Jacobson treated as central to the Mesopotamian understanding of death in his 1976 study, The Treasures of Darkness, a specific mechanism by which the vital essence of the deceased can be returned to the world of the living under specified circumstances. The Sumerian material is older than the Egyptian in some of its cores, and the correspondences to the Enochic doctrine, while less iconographically elaborate than the Egyptian correspondences, are structurally more precise in several respects. The Sumerian word for the underworld is Kur, a word whose concrete meaning is a mountain or a mountain range. The underworld, in the Sumerian conception, is located inside a mountain, and its interior is hollowed out into specific chambers with specific functions. The correspondence to the language of the 4 hollow places in chapter 22 of Enoch is not accidental. The JES word for the hollow place in Enoch 22, the word for a cavity carved into rock, has a semantic range that overlaps precisely with the Sumerian Kur, when Kur is used specifically for the underworld and not for a mountain in the ordinary sense. The two words describe the same category of structure, and the two structures perform the same function in their respective traditions. The dead are held inside the mountain, in sorted compartments, under the administration of a specific set of operators. The operators, in the Sumerian material, are named. The queen of the underworld is Ereshkigal, whose name means the Great Lady of the Great Earth. Her consort in the Akkadian tradition is Nergal, whose name is associated with plague and with the destructive aspect of the sun. Their subordinates are called, in the Akkadian, the Anunnaki, a term whose original Sumerian form referred to a specific class of divine beings who served as judges of the dead and as administrators of the operational structure of the underworld. The correspondence between the Anunnaki of the Sumerian and Akkadian material and the messengers of the Enochic corpus is one of the more precise parallels between the two traditions. Both categories of operators are described as administrators of the intake, the sorting, and the disposition of the dead. Both are described as intermediaries between the highest authority of their respective traditions and the specific individuals whose disposition they administer. And both are described as operating under a specific set of procedures that they cannot vary. The Sumerian word for the vital essence of the deceased is Giddim in the earlier texts, and Atemu in the Akkadian material that adapted the Sumerian conception. The Giddim leaves the body at death, travels to the underworld, and is received into the specific chamber appropriate to its category. The Giddim is not, in the Sumerian conception, a purely passive presence in the underworld. The Giddim requires maintenance. The maintenance is provided by the living family of the deceased in the form of ritual offerings called Kispu in the Akkadian, that are presented at specific dates in the ritual calendar and that provide the Giddim with the substance it requires to continue its existence in the underworld. If the Kispu offerings fail, the Giddim's condition deteriorates. If the deterioration is severe enough, the Giddim can, in the specific circumstances the texts describe, return to the world of the living to demand the offerings it has been denied. The return of a Giddim in this specific circumstance is described in the Akkadian medical and ritual texts, discussed at length in Jean Botero's Religion in Ancient Mesopotamia, and it is one of the specific mechanisms by which the Mesopotamian tradition understood the movement of the dead back into the world of the living. The descent of Inanna, in its Sumerian version preserved on tablets recovered from Nippur and dated to the early 2nd millennium before the Common Era, and in its Akkadian version preserved as the descent of Ishtar on tablets recovered from Nineveh and dated to the 7th century before the Common Era, describes a specific procedure by which a deceased entity can be brought back from the underworld under specific conditions. The procedure requires a substitution. When Inanna is killed in the underworld and hung on a hook by Ereshkigal, and when Enki, the god of wisdom, wishes to restore her to the world of the living, the restoration cannot be accomplished by the removal of Inanna's essence from the underworld unilaterally. A substitute has to be found. The substitute has to be a person or an entity who will take Inanna's place in the underworld so that the balance of intake and holding is maintained. The texts describe Inanna's search for the substitute, her rejection of several candidates who mourned her properly, and her selection of her husband Dumuzi who had not mourned her at all. Dumuzi is taken to the underworld in her place. Inanna returns to the world of the living. The balance is preserved. That procedure is not identical to the storehouse release of chapter 41 of Enoch, but it is structurally analogous in the specific respect that matters. The underworld, in the Sumerian conception, operates as a system with a conservation principle. The intake has to be balanced by the release, or by the substitution, if the system is not to fail. The Enochic corpus describes the conservation principle in terms of the periodic release of the retained spirits into new bodies. The Sumerian corpus describes it in terms of the substitution of one entity for another in the underworld's population. Both traditions treat the underworld as a working system with a conservation constraint, and the constraint, in both traditions, requires that the movement of essence between the world of the living and the world of the dead be regulated according to procedures the specific operators are required to follow. The 12th tablet of the standard Babylonian version of the Gilgamesh epic, which Andrew George's 2003 edition treats as a later addition to the epic and not as an integral part of the composition of the earlier 11 tablets, contains the most detailed surviving Mesopotamian account of the conditions of the various categories of the dead in the underworld. Enkidu, who has died in Tablet 7 of the epic, is questioned by Gilgamesh about what he has seen in the underworld. The account Enkidu gives is a systematic one. He describes the conditions of those who died in various circumstances. Those who died in the fullness of their years and were properly mourned by their families are held in specific chambers where their conditions are described in terms of the offerings they receive from their descendants. Those who died in specific categories of premature death, in specific categories of violence, in specific categories of childlessness that prevented the establishment of the descendants required for the Kispu offerings, are held in different chambers, and their conditions are described in terms specific to their category. The sorting principle in the 12th tablet is precise. The categories are enumerated, and the fate of each category is specified in operational language that corresponds, in its structural features, to the language of the 4 hollow places in chapter 22 of Enoch. The correspondence between the 12th tablet of Gilgamesh and chapter 22 of Enoch has been noted by scholars working on the ancient Near Eastern background of Second Temple pseudepigrapha. The correspondence is not the result of Enochic dependence on the Gilgamesh material directly, but it is consistent with a common source in the older Mesopotamian understanding of the sorting of the dead that both traditions preserved. The specific categories differ between the two traditions. The Enochic material sorts the dead by moral condition and by the completion status of the assignment. The 12th tablet sorts the dead by the circumstances of the death itself and by the provision of the required Kispu offerings. But both traditions treat the sorting as a specific procedure carried out by named operators according to specific criteria. And both traditions preserve the sorted dead in specific chambers whose functions are enumerated. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, recorded in its standard form on tablets recovered from the library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh and dated to the 7th century before the Common Era, contains a passage that has to be examined in the context of the 7th teaching in this account. The passage describes the establishment of the operational structure of the world after Marduk's defeat of Tiamat. The establishment involves the creation of the storehouses of the winds, the storehouses of the rains, the storehouses of the heavenly bodies, and the sworn agreements by which the operational structure is held in place. The parallel to the description, in chapter 69 of Enoch, of the sworn oath and the storehouses, is not incidental. The Enuma Elish, though it is not the immediate source of the Enochic material, is a witness to a Mesopotamian tradition of describing the operational structure of the world in the specific language of a working system held in place by sworn agreements, and that tradition provides the background against which the Enochic material was composed. The Book of Parables did not invent the language of the sworn oath and the storehouses. The Book of Parables inherited the language from a Mesopotamian tradition that had been using it for at least 1,000 years before the composition of the Enochic corpus. The three ancient traditions, Egyptian, Sumerian, and Akkadian, and Jewish through the Enochic corpus, converge on a common set of structural features in their descriptions of the dead. The dead are held in specific chambers inside a specific location. The chambers are administered by named operators. The intake is continuous. The retention is for specified periods. The release is directed towards specific outcomes, whether in the elevation of the deceased to a further stage of existence, in the substitution required to preserve the conservation of the operational structure, or in the return of the vital essence to a new body being prepared on the earth. The whole operational structure is held in place by sworn agreements, described in the Egyptian material as the ordering laid down by Ma'at, in the Mesopotamian material as the tablets of destinies and the assigned functions of the Anunnaki, and in the Enochic material as the sworn oath upheld by the hidden name entrusted to Michael. The convergence is remarkable. It is not the result of textual dependence in any single direction, and it is the specific evidence this account has been building toward for the claim that the mechanism the seven teachings describe was not a purely Jewish or purely Enochic invention, but was a widely attested feature of the ancient Near Eastern understanding of what happens to the dead. That evidence has now been presented. What remains is the closing of the account, the return to the manuscript at Aksum, where the Ge'ez text has been preserved in continuous liturgical use since the middle of the 4th century of the Common Era, and the specific implication for the modern reader of the fact that the doctrine the seven teachings reconstruct has been available in a Christian communion continuously for the entire period during which the Latin and Greek churches were teaching a different doctrine. What the reader does with the material is the reader's own decision. That the material exists, that it is preserved in the specific manuscript this account has referred to throughout, and that its content is what this account has presented, is what the account has demonstrated. The demonstration is now complete. The closing will now return to what the demonstration means. Before the close, one further set of parallels has to be noted, because the correspondences involve specific details that go beyond the general structural convergence this account has already described. The specific details concern the naming of the operators, the specific ritual acts by which the ancient traditions maintain the correspondence between the living and the dead, and the specific correspondences among the calendars of the three traditions. The naming of the operators is the first of these details. Chapter 41 of Enoch names Uriel as the operator of the storehouse of the spirits. Chapter 20 of Enoch names Uriel as the one set over the world and over the storehouses of the underworld. The Egyptian material names Anubis as the operator who conducts the deceased to the hall of the weighing, and Thoth as the recorder. The Sumerian material names the Anunnaki as the operators, and Eresh-Kigal as the presiding authority. The Akkadian material adds Nergal as consort of Eresh-Kigal. The three traditions name operators with distinct proper names, but the operators perform the same functions in each. The correspondence is not at the level of the names, which differ, but at the level of the offices, which do not. The specific ritual acts by which the ancient traditions maintain the correspondence between the living and the dead is the second of these details. The Egyptian tradition provided offerings at the tombs of the deceased. The offerings were designated for the sustenance of the Ka, and the specific procedures for the presentation of the offerings are recorded in the mortuary texts and in the tomb inscriptions of the New Kingdom period. The Sumerian and Akkadian traditions provided the Kispu offerings at specific dates in the ritual calendar. The Kispu were designated for the sustenance of the Gidim and the Etemu, and the specific procedures for their presentation are recorded in the ritual texts recovered from the temple archives of Ur, Nippur, and Nineveh. The Jewish tradition, in the form the Book of Parables preserves, does not include a specific offering practice of this kind, Because the doctrine of chapter 41 describes the storehouse as a self-sustaining system whose intake and release are managed by the operators without requiring external maintenance from the living. But the earlier Hebrew Bible does preserve, in the form of the specific prohibitions against consulting the dead in the 18th chapter of Deuteronomy, and in the specific narrative of the summoning of the shade of Samuel in the 28th chapter of 1 Samuel, the traces of a Jewish tradition of communication with the dead that the mainstream of the Second Temple period had rejected, but that the Enochic corpus preserves in a modified form as the intercession of the souls of the righteous in the dwelling described in chapter 39. The specific correspondences among the calendars of the three traditions is the third of these details. The Egyptian tradition observed a specific set of days as the festival of the reception of the dead into the world of Osiris, corresponding to the annual cycle of the flooding of the Nile and the associated agricultural calendar. The Sumerian and Akkadian traditions observed a specific set of days as the festival of the Kispu, at which the offerings were presented to the ancestral Giddim. The Jewish tradition observed the Day of Atonement in the 7th month of the ritual calendar, on which the specific procedures of the 10th day of the 7th month were carried out in the Second Temple, as they had been carried out earlier in the wilderness tabernacle. The Ethiopian Orthodox tradition, in its liturgical calendar, observes the feast of Uriel on the 11th of Saneh, corresponding to the 18th of June in the Western calendar, and on that day the specific passage from chapter 41 of Enoch is read aloud in the churches of the Aksum region, as this account has already noted. The four calendars have specific festivals dedicated to the boundary between the living and the dead. The specific dates do not correspond among the traditions, but the specific existence of the festivals, and the specific purpose to which the festivals are dedicated, is a common feature of the four traditions taken together. The convergence at the level of these three sets of specific details, added to the convergence at the level of the general operational structure that this account has already described, produces a picture the reader should take into account before drawing a conclusion about what the seven teachings describe. Four traditions, spanning approximately 3,000 years of documentary evidence, converge on a common account of the operational structure of the world of the dead. Whether the convergence results from a common source in an older tradition, or from independent arrival at the same account, or from each tradition describing a real feature of the way the world works, is a question the surviving evidence cannot fully settle. But convergence itself is documented across all of the four traditions. The manuscript in the cedar box in the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion in Aksum is one of a set of similar manuscripts held in the ecclesiastical libraries of the Ethiopian highlands. Not all copies of Enoch preserved in Ethiopia are held at Aksum. Copies are also held at Debre Damo, at Debre Libanos, at the monasteries of Lake Tana, and at several of the churches of Gondar. The tradition of copying and preserving the Ge'ez text has never been interrupted since the initial translation from the Greek intermediate text sometime between the 4th and 6th centuries of the Common Era. The scribes who produced the manuscripts worked from earlier manuscripts under specific procedures of the Ethiopian monastic tradition, and the procedures were designed to prevent the accidental introduction of variant readings that would corrupt the transmission. The manuscripts vary among themselves in minor details of orthography, and in the presence or absence of specific marginal notations, but the substantive content of the Book of Enoch is preserved across the tradition with a fidelity that the modern textual critics who have collated the surviving copies have generally treated as remarkable for a manuscript tradition of that duration. The Ge'ez text that Ephraim Isaac translated for the Charlesworth Old Testament pseudepigrapha in 1983 was compiled from several of the best surviving manuscripts, weighted according to their age and their independence from one another. The translation preserves the concrete language of the Ge'ez in a way that the earlier English translations, including Charles's 1912 edition, did not. Where the Ge'ez says storehouse, Isaac writes storehouse. When the Ge'ez says vessel of the appointed, that is what appears in his English. The Ge'ez terms for intake and retention and release are preserved as intake and retention and release. The specificity is preserved. And the specificity is what allows the modern reader, following the account this video has presented, to see what the Ge'ez text is actually saying about the doctrine of the dead and the mechanism of the return of souls to bodies being prepared on the earth. The account this video has presented has followed a specific order. The first three teachings establish the geometry of the chambers, the assignment of the righteous to the dwelling and the maintenance work, and the mechanism of the storehouse with its intake, its retention, its release, and its specific reason for the release. The pause at the halfway mark of the video separated those three teachings from the four that followed. The fourth teaching addressed the specific mechanism of the release, the measuring cords, the vessels of the appointed, and the chosen one, who presides over the accounting of completed assignments. The fifth teaching addressed the promise made to the spirits of the righteous who died in sorrow and the priority handling their storehouse retention receives. The sixth teaching addressed the sorting criterion for the release queue, based on the specific cooperation of each spirit with the requirements of the assignment during the previous embodiment. And the seventh teaching addressed the regulatory guarantee under which the whole system operates, the sworn oath established at the beginning under the authority of the Lord of Spirits and upheld by a hidden name entrusted to Michael. Read in sequence. The seven teachings produce a specific doctrine of the dead. The doctrine has features that are unfamiliar to a reader raised in the framework the Latin canon transmits. The doctrine holds that the dead are not passive presences waiting for a final judgment at the end of the age, but are active participants in the ongoing maintenance of the world of the living, that some of the dead are the specific substance from which the operational structure of the world draws its supply, and that the spirits held in the storehouse are released back into new bodies being prepared on the earth for the completion of assignments that were not completed in the previous embodiment. The doctrine holds that the return is regulated by a specific procedure, administered by named messengers, according to specific criteria involving the completion status of each spirit's original assignment and the degree of cooperation with the requirements of the assignment during the previous lifetime. And the doctrine holds that the whole system is stable, that its stability is engineered rather than continuously improvised, and that the engineering takes the form of a sworn oath upheld by a hidden name. This doctrine, in its Ge'ez form at Aksum, has been available for reading and for liturgical use in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church for approximately 15 centuries. It was not available in the Latin and Greek churches during that same period, because the Council of Laodicea in 364 removed the book that contained it, and the Council of Constantinople in 553 condemned the theologian Origen, whose writings had preserved the doctrine within Christian teaching in the 2 centuries following the initial removal. The Ethiopian tradition preserved what the Western traditions removed. That preservation is a specific historical fact. It is documented in the manuscript record, in the liturgical practice of the surviving Ethiopian Orthodox congregations, and in the scholarly work of the last 2 centuries during which the manuscript tradition has been studied by scholars outside Ethiopia. The parallels to the Egyptian and Babylonian material provide the second layer of the account this video has presented. The Egyptian material, older by more than 1,000 years than the Enochic corpus in its earliest antecedents, describes a system with the same operational structure. The Ka is the animating substance. The great house is the storehouse. The weighing of the heart is the accounting of the assignment. The vessel held by the attendant figure in the mortuary vignettes is the vessel of the appointed of chapter 61 of Enoch. The daily cycle of the sun god through the underworld and back into the sky at dawn is the storehouse cycle at a scaled-down frequency. The correspondence is not the result of textual dependence. It is the result of 2 traditions describing the same operational structure in their respective vocabularies. The Babylonian and Sumerian material provides the third layer. The underworld inside the mountain is the 4 hollow places of chapter 22 of Enoch. The Anunnaki are the messengers of chapter 41. The Giddim and the Itemu are the vital essence, the correspondent of the Jez Nafas. The conservation principle in the Descent of Inanna is the same conservation principle chapter 41 describes as the reason for the periodic release of the retained spirits. The sworn agreements in the Enuma Elish are the correspondent of the sworn oath in chapter 69. The 3 traditions converge on the same account of the operational structure of the world of the dead, and the convergence is preserved in the surviving documentary base, in each tradition, in a form that the modern reader can examine and evaluate for themselves. There is one further layer of the account that this video has referred to at several points, but has not yet developed at length. That layer is the modern medical evidence for the specific phenomena that occur at the boundary between life and death. In the interval between the cessation of the brain and the return of the pulse, in the cases where resuscitation restores the individual to living consciousness. That evidence has been collected systematically over the last 40 years by a specific set of researchers working at named institutions with specific methodologies, and the evidence has been published in the peer-reviewed medical literature. It is not the evidence of one tradition or one framework. It is the evidence of the observed behavior of consciousness at the specific boundary the ancient traditions were describing. And the specific features of the evidence correspond, in ways that are worth examining, to the features of the mechanism the Enochic and Egyptian and Babylonian traditions describe. The systematic study of what has come to be called the near-death experience began with the publication of Raymond Moody's Life After Life in 1975. Moody, a philosophy graduate student who had become interested in the reports of individuals who had been medically resuscitated after periods of clinical death, collected approximately 150 case reports from patients he had interviewed either directly or through the referrals of the medical personnel who had treated them. The reports had specific structural features that Moody identified in the book. The features included the departure of consciousness from the body, the passage through a specific tunnel or passageway, the arrival at a specific location that the reporters described in various terms, including a light, a garden, a hall, or a specific structure, the encounter with specific entities that the reporters identified variously as deceased relatives, as figures of religious significance, or as unknown but benevolent presences, and the eventual return of consciousness to the body accompanied by a specific transition that the reporters described as a decision, a communication, or a directive from the entities they had encountered. The book was widely read on its initial publication, and it initiated a research program that has continued for the 50 years since. The most systematic of the subsequent studies have been carried out by 3 research groups. The first is the group at the University of Virginia's Division of Perceptual Studies, founded by Ian Stevenson in 1967 and now directed by Bruce Grayson, whose research on near-death experiences has been published continuously since the early 1980s. Grayson's specific contribution to the field has been the development of a standardized scale, the Grayson Near-Death Experience Scale, that permits the systematic classification of individual cases according to their specific features. The scale has been used in hundreds of subsequent studies, and it has produced a substantial body of quantitative data on the frequency and the distribution of specific features across the reported cases. The second is the group at Southampton General Hospital in the United Kingdom, whose original study was conducted by Sam Parnia in the late 1990s, and whose subsequent AWARE study, conducted from 2008 through 2012 at 15 hospitals in the United States, the United Kingdom, and Austria, was designed specifically to test whether the reported experiences occurred during the periods of documented clinical death or in the periods immediately before or after. The results of the AWARE study were published in the journal Resuscitation in 2014. The follow-up AWARE-2 study, which extended the methodology to a larger sample, was published in the same journal in 2023. The third is the group associated with the cardiologist Pim van Lommel in the Netherlands, whose prospective study of near-death experiences in resuscitated cardiac arrest patients was published in The Lancet in December of 2001, and whose subsequent work has been summarized in his 2010 book, Consciousness Beyond Life. The specific findings of the 3 research groups have been the subject of extended scholarly and popular commentary. What matters, for the account this video is presenting, is the specific set of structural features that the case reports collectively describe. Those features are the following. The individual experiencing the near-death event reports a departure of consciousness from the body at the moment of the clinical death. The consciousness reports the ability to observe the surrounding physical environment from a location outside the body. The consciousness reports a passage through a specific transitional environment, described in the reports variously as a tunnel, a corridor, a passageway, or a gradient of light. The consciousness reports arrival at a specific location, whose features the reports describe in language that varies among reporters, but that shares specific structural elements. The consciousness reports the encounter with specific entities, some of whom the reporter identifies and some of whom the reporter does not. The consciousness reports the receipt of specific communications from the encountered entities regarding the reporter's continued embodiment and the specific reasons for the return to it. And the consciousness reports the return to the body, accompanied by the reintegration of the observing awareness with the physical apparatus of the brain and the sensory organs. These features are what the reports describe. Whether the features accurately represent the actual experience of consciousness during the interval of clinical death, or whether they represent the reconstruction of the experience after the fact by the mechanism of memory formation and retrieval that operates when consciousness is restored, is a question the research programs continue to work on. The specific evidence for the accuracy of the reports, as descriptions of experience during the interval of clinical death, comes from the specific cases in which the reports include verified observations of the resuscitation procedures themselves, observations that the reporter could not have made through the ordinary sensory channels because the sensory channels were not functioning during the interval when the observations were reportedly made. The AWARE study documented a small number of such cases. The AWARE-2 study documented a further small number. The interpretive question these cases raise is not what this account is going to attempt to settle. The interpretive question the account will note is that the reports the studies have collected have specific features that correspond to specific features of the mechanism the 7 teachings describe. The correspondence is not complete. The near-death reports do not, in general, describe the storehouse operational structure that Chapter 41 of Enoch describes. The near-death reports do not describe the measuring cords or the vessels of the appointed. The near-death reports do not describe the accounting of the assignment by the chosen one. But the near-death reports do describe the departure of consciousness from the body, the passage to a specific location, the encounter with entities who communicate about the continued embodiment, and the return to the body. Those 4 features correspond, respectively, to the departure of the naphas from the body at death, to the arrival of the naphas at the storehouse for retention, to the specific communication of the assignment by the operators who administer the storehouse, and to the release of the naphas into the body being prepared for its reception. The correspondence is at the level of the structural sequence rather than at the level of the specific vocabulary. But the structural sequence is what the ancient traditions were describing, and the structural sequence is what the modern near-death reports are also describing. The specific claim this account is making is not that the near-death reports prove the Enochic mechanism. The specific claim is that the reports and the mechanism produced by cultures separated by 3,000 years and by every relevant cultural feature describe overlapping phenomena in language more similar than it should be by chance. The reader is being invited to consider what the overlap means. The reader is not being told what to conclude. The reports are what the reports are. The mechanism is what the mechanism is. The correspondence between them is what this account has just described. And the significance of the correspondence, for the reader who has followed the account this far, is that the doctrine of the storehouse and the return, preserved in J.S. at Aksum for 15 centuries, may correspond to something that is actually observed in the specific circumstances of clinical death when the observation is made possible by the modern medical procedures that permit the interval to be extended and the reporter to be restored to consciousness for the report to be given. That is what the correspondence means. In the specific terms this account has been careful to preserve. The reader has to decide what to do with it. The account has presented the material, has identified its sources, has cited the scholars and the manuscripts on which the presentation rests, and has drawn the correspondences between the ancient traditions and the modern medical evidence at the level the correspondences actually support. What further conclusion the reader draws is the reader's own affair. There is one final passage that this account will present before the return to the manuscript in the cedar box at Aksum. The passage is not in the Book of Enoch. The passage is a specific detail preserved in the liturgical practice of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church on the days of the year when the Book of Enoch is read aloud in the churches of the Aksum region. The liturgical calendar of the Ethiopian tradition assigns specific portions of the Enochic corpus to specific feasts, and one of the assigned readings is the passage from chapter 41 that this account has spent the most time on. The passage is read on the feast day of Uriel, whose commemoration in the Ethiopian tradition falls on the 11th day of the Ethiopian month of Sane, which corresponds in the Western calendar to the 18th of June. On that day, in the churches of Aksum and of the surrounding highland region, the passage that describes the storehouse of the spirits and the release of the retained spirits into bodies being prepared on the earth is read aloud in Ge'ez before the assembled congregation. It has been read on that day in that specific form for approximately 1,500 years. The doctrine has not been hidden. It has been in continuous public liturgical use for the entire period during which the Latin and Greek churches were teaching a different doctrine. The only reason it has been unknown to Western readers is that Western readers, until James Bruce brought the manuscripts back in 1773 and until Isaac produced the modern translation in 1983, did not read Ge'ez and did not have access to what the tradition had been teaching in the language its scribes had preserved. The doctrine, in its specific form, has consequences for the framework within which the reader has been raised to understand the position of the living human being in the operational structure of the world. In the framework the Latin canon transmits, the living human being has one life on the earth. What that life is for is determined by the individual's decisions and by the specific circumstances of the family, the community, and the historical moment into which the individual was born. The purpose of the life is to arrive, at its end, at a specific destination that will not be changed. The categories of the destination are limited, the judgment is made once, and the outcome, once made, is permanent. In the framework, Enoch's chapter 41 describes, the living human being is on assignment. The assignment was given at the original creation of the spirit that animates the body. The assignment may or may not be the same as the specific circumstances the individual finds themselves in during a given lifetime. The purpose of the life is not to arrive at a destination, but to make progress on the assignment. The progress is measurable, in the specific terms the Enochic corpus uses, by the degree of cooperation between the desires of the flesh and the requirements of the assignment. The progress is retained across successive embodiments, so that the assignment resumes at the point of interruption in the next lifetime. And the outcome, whatever it will be, is not made once. The outcome is made continuously, as the successive lifetimes accumulate the progress on the assignment until the assignment is complete. Those are two different frameworks. The reader will have inherited one of them or the other, or in some cases a mixed version drawn from both, according to the specific religious and cultural background of the family and the community into which the reader was born. The reader who has followed this account this far now knows that a specific ancient tradition, preserved in continuous liturgical use in a specific Christian communion for 1500 years, describes the framework in the terms of the second version, and that the same framework is described in structurally similar terms in the older Egyptian and Babylonian material this account has also presented. The reader does not have to accept the framework, but the reader now knows that the framework exists, that it is preserved in specific manuscripts held in specific ecclesiastical libraries in a specific country, and that it corresponds, in ways this account has documented, to specific features of the modern medical evidence for what occurs at the boundary between life and death. The manuscript in the cedar box in the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion in Aksum has been kept by the specific individuals responsible for its custody since the initial deposit sometime in the 6th or 7th century of the Common Era. The chain of custody is documented in the Church's own records and in the reports of the various Western travelers who have visited Aksum from the 18th century onward. James Bruce visited the church in the 1770s. Henry Salt visited in 1805 and 1810 as the emissary of Lord Valentia. James Theodore Bent visited in 1893. Wallace Budge described the church in his 1928 edition of the History of Ethiopia. Ephraim Isaac visited in the course of preparing his 1983 translation. And the chain of the ecclesiastical custodians who have received the manuscript from their predecessors and passed it to their successors is unbroken across the entire period. The specific individuals responsible for the custody are members of the Ethiopian Orthodox monastic clergy, and the transmission of the responsibility follows the specific procedures of that tradition. What has been kept in the specific way, by the specific individuals, in the specific location, for the specific purpose. And what has been kept is the manuscript that preserves, in Ge'ez, the doctrine this account has reconstructed. The reader now living has access to that doctrine, for the first time in the history of the reader's own language, in the translation Ephraim Isaac produced in 1983. The translation is available in the Doubleday Old Testament pseudepigrapha, edited by James Charlesworth, and copies are held in every major research library and in most theological library collections in the United States and in Europe. The reader who wishes to verify what this account has presented can consult the translation directly. The specific passages this account has referenced are all in the standard edition. The chapter numbers are, as this account has given them. The wording is, as this account has described it. The doctrine is what this account has reconstructed. Nothing about the presentation has depended on material the reader cannot verify from public sources available in ordinary academic libraries. The account this video has presented has therefore been a specific one, not a speculation about what the ancient traditions might have believed. Not a reconstruction based on inferences from secondary sources. A specific account of what a specific manuscript, preserved by a specific religious tradition, translated by a specific modern scholar, actually says. The manuscript exists, the tradition preserves it, the translation renders it, and the doctrine the translation preserves is what this video has just spent 3 hours describing. That the doctrine is unfamiliar to the reader raised in a different framework is a fact about the reader's own inherited framework, not a fact about the doctrine. The doctrine has been available continuously for 15 centuries. It has been unknown to the Western reader only because the Western reader has not, until recently, had access to it in a language the reader could read. That is the significance of the account this video has presented. The 7 teachings are what they are. The Egyptian and Babylonian parallels are what they are. The modern medical evidence is what it is. And the correspondence among the 3 levels of evidence is what this account has documented. The doctrine of the dead as active participants in the operational structure of the world, of the storehouse of the spirits as the reservoir from which the maintenance of the world draws its supply, and of the return of souls to bodies being prepared on the earth for the completion of the assignments given at their original creation, is the doctrine that all three levels of evidence together support. It is the doctrine chapter 41 of Enoch preserves in Ge'ez. The Council of Laodicea removed it from the Latin and Greek canon in 364. The Council of Constantinople condemned it in 553 through the anathemas issued against the writings of Origen, and it is the doctrine the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition has read aloud in the churches of Aksum on the feast day of the messenger Uriel every 18th of June for approximately 1,500 years. The video will close where it began. The manuscript is in a cedar box. The cedar box is in the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion. The Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion is in Aksum, in northern Ethiopia. The chapter is numbered 22 in the book that the Ethiopian tradition preserves. The passage describes 4 hollow places carved into the interior of a mountain in the far west of the world. The 4 hollow places contain the sordid dead. The dead are not passive. The dead are working. The souls of the righteous, in the first chamber, are near a bright spring that supplies what the working of the sky draws on. The souls of those who died in sorrow are given priority for the return to bodies being prepared. The souls of the humble, who cooperated with the assignment during their previous embodiment, are sorted for specific tasks on the return. The messenger, Uriel, operates the storehouse. The messenger, Michael, holds the hidden name that upholds the sworn oath. And the system, running under the guarantee of that oath, has been running continuously since the beginning and will continue running, according to the wording of chapter 69, until the day the sworn oath is fulfilled and the mechanism the oath established completes its final release. What the reader does with the account of the mechanism the reader has just heard is now the reader's own decision. The account has been given, the sources have been named, the manuscripts have been identified, the scholars have been cited, the correspondences have been drawn, and the manuscript in the cedar box, in the church, in the town of Aksum, remains where it has always been. It waits for those who wish to consult it. It preserves what it preserves, and the doctrine it preserves, on the reading this account has offered, is that the dead are not gone, that the dead are working, and that some of the dead will be sent back down into bodies being prepared on the earth for the completion of assignments that were not completed in the previous lifetime. That is what the manuscript says. That is what this account has been telling the reader, and that is where the account now ends.